All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I am joined once again by James Tunney. And James, before we start, I also want to say congratulations on the publication of your new book, Plantation of the Automatons. I have been reading through it. I'm not quite done with it. It's about 800 pages, but it's really good. And I appreciate you sending me the copy. And as always, it's a pleasure to be able to connect and see where we explore.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation. As always, Evan, enjoyed your interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And I definitely would encourage any of the listeners, whether this is your first time tuning in with this conversation, the previous ones, if you guys are interested in exploring more, I would highly recommend your new book, Plantation of the Automatons, and I'll have that in the episode show notes if people are interested in learning more about that, because it is a fantastic read and really even gives, you cite so much. It's almost within our conversations, there's so many sources that you're able to just sort of cite off of the top of your head, which I find very impressive. But even in the book, there's a wealth of citations. So, if people want even further depth, I would highly encourage them to check it out. But James, I would love to start the conversation. Maybe if you could give an overview, a contextualization, sort of where the direction that we're going to go in with this conversation, and the type of backdrop I think that's necessary for people, just in terms of following along and having the depth of understanding on where it is that you're coming from with your position, and maybe that could be a good starting point for the discussion today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just to summarize or contextualize, especially if someone hasn't seen some of our previous conversations or seen any of the work before, my primary commitment or message is that we all have to engage in spiritual evolution as individuals and as a species, and that our problems, the problems that we face, are associated with a failure to evolve spiritually. So that's my starting point, and associated with that is a very positive message about the power of our spiritual consciousness and the need to activate and unleash and explore it, and explore the imaginal, artistic, imaginative realm as part of that process. But the major preoccupation in the series that we've talked about has been about dystopia and the fear and the probability that we will live in a totalitarian regime. And I have argued that it could be asserted that from the 1st of January 2020, we moved into the start of what I would call a scientocracy, which will be a totalitarian regime based on scientism, which I call the empire of scientism. So it's not real science, it's the appearance of science. It's the overextension of the scientific method as a mode of governance, and that this will only get worse. It intends to be, and is calculated to be, a scheme of global governance. It will define global governance and will displace all other methodologies, and that we will live in that context, be treated as animals, as the scientocrats say. And that will get worse. That will be a reversionary process in evolution, so that ultimately we will be treated more like plants. And that's a theme that I have elucidated in the book. So that's not a jolly message, but anyone with half a brain can see in the world that things are not as they seem to be, and that we have many problems. They seem unrelated, but they're not if we look at an overall scheme. So I've argued that it's an empire of scientism, that we're living in tech bondage, and you can see that theme of bondage coming up in recent contexts. It's a real issue, because my argument is that this appeal to reason really brings us back to people like the Marquis de Sade, who was a champion of reason. Reason without other values becomes something else, and anything can be made reasonable if you have no higher values. So a characteristic of this totalitarian regime will be that it's quite sadistic. This will be a feature of the regime. That's not, people don't want to hear that, but I mean, I think if you begin to look at what they have said they're going to do, and want to do, you'll see that there's merit in this. So part of this agenda is a mixture of technocracy and transhumanism. Now, technocracy refers to a very specific mode of governance, which was promoted in the 20s and 30s, based on the shift from an economy that we're familiar with to an economy based on energy certificates. This is what is happening in relation to the energy regime at the moment. It's breaking down traditional supply chains so that we will be integrated into a controlled electricity grid, and everything will be worked off that currency, what you're allowed to do, etc. Now that's technocracy in its narrow and specific meaning. So that's why I use the word scientocracy often as a broader description of that kind of false scientism idea, which can bring in technocracy. And it's quite clear if you look at what the scientists told us in the 1920s of their agenda for the future, that the world becomes intelligible if you compare it to what they said. And in particular, people like John Desmond Bernal, who was born in Ireland, and he advocated or anticipated a future that they wanted. He would have been around the same milieu as H.G. Wells, who of course proposed the New World Order. That was the book, and proposed a scientocracy, a scientific elite running the world through a biodirectorate by securing control over people's health on a worldwide basis, and abolishing the family, the nation state, and religion. Now, Bernal said, and he proposed, for example, that we'd have ectogenesis, which is where children are born outside a womb, a matrix. And this week, for example, if you look at the Daily Mail, I had a picture of babies in these pods, and saying, this is a conversation we have to have. It's funny, in the same papers, there was complaints about men talking to women. So you can't have a conversation with someone of the opposite sex, but you're forced to have a conversation about children being born in this dystopian thing. And that was the basis of Brave New World. So these things they told us these were coming. So it's no surprise that they were coming. Every time these things come, they vindicate the idea that this is the policy that's determining where we're going to. So as well as Bernal talked about transhumanism, that we would become mechanized, we would be turned from an organic being into a mechanical being, and space exploration was a key element. The space exploration was really to allow a colony for the elite to be able to leave the Earth behind as they wished, so that the Earth would become a human zoo. So this is the model that they talked about 100 years ago. So they've been working on this for at least a century. Everything they do is consistent with this. So it's clear, if anyone studies, if you come from a legal background like mine, that the state has been denationalized. There has been a process of taking sovereignty away from nation states. That's what globalization really was. It was to take power away from nation states. It wasn't to give the individuals power to fly around the world and do what they wanted. That wasn't the idea. It was to shift the focus of power onto a global scale. So my argument suggests is that if you look at what the scientists said they were going to do, and people like Bernal and Wells and Haldane and Arthur C. Clarke, they were continuing a policy which had begun about the time of Darwin, and in particular by Thomas Huxley, where they were going to use the empire, in particular the British Empire, to take over the world in many senses through science. So they're going to shift away from political control to control of a scientific regime. And that began in the 1860s in parallel to the growth of the telecommunications system, which is a key part of this notion. So that's a starting point to come to my argument that we're going to live in a plantation, a global plantation of automatons. The automatons will include robots and will include us transformed into a machine-like subhuman species for the benefit of an elite and for their management under an automatic system of governance. Now, that's not jolly for a lot of people if they haven't opened their mind to that. But it's better to focus on the truth. And in fact, if you look at work on groups that have survived in the context of great oppression, it's the resilient groups are people that focus on the truth and then begin to seek control over some element and work with that. So it's not meant to be a depressing message, but we have to be honest.
Right, absolutely. And it's one of the messages where, if we hear somebody looks back 20, 30 years from now, if this podcast is still available, is they might wipe the interwebs of all remnants of truth, right? But, they could reflect and say, oh, wow, I see how that step was integrated or how this was integrated. And it's not all going to come in tomorrow necessarily and smack us in the face. It's this slow and steady integration process so that all of the elements you just talked about, they're implemented one step at a time. Because if you have this brave new world switch overnight, then people are going to start wondering what's going on. But if you can slowly implement all of this, people can take it one step at a time, little baby steps, the totalitarian tiptoe, as David Icke calls it, because you can't sprint into this. And so, something like the ecto.
But just one point on that. That's true. And it follows C.S. Lewis's slow road to hell that he talked about in the Screw Tape Letters. But one point to remember is that I think that the main phase of the process could have been from 1863 to 1963. So by the time we're at 1963, when people think we're getting liberated, I think we were moving into final stages. It probably went in 20-year stages. So, for example, from the time that Winston Churchill in 1943 said that we can only have anarchy or order, and he was talking about the empire of the mind in 1943. 1963 was a very important year and a dark year in many senses. So the great efflorescence in music was really a function of control in my reading of it rather than of liberation. So we're in a check situation in chess terms. It's that far advanced in my view. And one of the points, I don't want people to get too hopeful, is there's a lot of people believing that it's cracking now, that this thing, because they've noticed it, that it's cracking. But you've noticed it because they have nothing to fear in their eyes. They have set up the system. The concrete is set, that it's going to be very difficult for it to come out with it. So that's right. But it's going to go quicker now. The movement, the speed will go so quick. Just when you're beginning to get one's head around one thing, it'll come quicker because they know now that they have to move and that they have the opportunity through the process, and they don't want any counter movement. So in many ways, they're preparing for what they think is going to be a backlash. And that's what a lot of the new legislation is coming in. So in recent times, you see a polarization. You see, for example, in the last couple of weeks, a lot more anti-Semitism in the media, classic anti-Semitism. Now, this is a deliberate polarization to try and put people or attract people to a position in order to justify the emergency legislation, the legislation they'll bring in and they have also proposed in Britain during the health crisis, they considered letting prisoners out, and this is a thing that you see in America, that law enforcement is going down in many contexts, and one of the reasons I think that is because they're going to put a different type of prisoner in these prisons, political prisoners, meaning anyone who opposes the system. So yes, and subject to that qualification.
Right. And that's the almost great paradox if you look at the last 100 years, where it appears there is this great sense of individual liberation and reclamation of individual spirit over the last 100 years, when the reality is, you look at something like Brave New World, which was written, I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head, 1930s, 1940s. It was very clear in that outline the direction that we were moving, and talking about ectogenesis and talking about all of these futuristic ideas, whether it's H.G. Wells with New World Order, right? All of these, like, it's been very clear even then that this seems to be the direction we've been moving in. And I definitely agree with you where we are. I started playing chess, I think, within the last 4 or 5 months, and I've, it's a very liberating game. And I agree with you in a sense that we are in sort of a check situation, and maybe not checkmate. We're not completely cornered, but
No,
it's definitely we're in a bit of a, I guess, desperate times because it
an
is
end game, yeah, an
yeah,
end game.
it is rapidly increasing. And something that's interesting, kind of, and I think maybe this could be a good starting question, is we look at a lot of this technology and we look at a lot of the sort of advancements, if you want to call them that, over the last 100 years as this, it's sold as this great convenience. It's sold as this prospect of liberation, and something that the transhumanist ideology centers on is this idea as tech as the great expansion of consciousness and the great evolution of consciousness, how we can unlock some sort of infinite potential by going into this. I don't know. Recently, there was the app Lenza, which a lot of people downloaded, and it was the #1 app on the Apple iTunes store, for example, where people would submit 20 photos to this AI and get back this beautiful imagery. I refuse to call it artwork because it's not artwork, imagery. But it was amazing to me, even, and I follow a lot of different spiritual, I guess you could call them influencers on various social media. And I would see even them post about how AI potentially representing this type of exploration. And so in a way, it was very, I don't know. It didn't make me feel very good, to say the least, to see that, there's even in the spiritual community, there's this pull towards this type of technology. And basically, when we're looking at the idea of a loop system, it's being sold as this infinite exploration, when in reality, you've described it as a closed circuit loop, and that really feels to me like this is the reality of this type of technology. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that and maybe sort of the paradoxical message people are given and why they feel called to actually explore, and think that maybe this represents some sort of infinite merging with the cosmos, when in reality it's much more of a closed loop and actual halting and
Yeah,
desecration of spiritual
you
consciousness.
have this idea of technosis, the idea that the idea that you can have this kind of Gnostic expansion with technology, and there's a positive element, and a lot of people think that. For me, what's happening is we're being turned inside out. And again, people don't get that, but we're being turned inside out. So the idea is to go in and penetrate and turn your innermost ideas outward with technology, while they penetrate and substitute your consciousness, which is, you see that loop everywhere in relation to these big companies. I think it represents that penetration of human consciousness. So we're talking about the colonization of consciousness. Every new technology is described as some great opportunity, some great convenience, some great amplifier of human nature, and there's no doubt that they can do. But there's a price for everything, and the price for us is the loss of our humanity. This is the cost, because we're talking about an increasing concentration into a giant loop, a giant concentration of technology, which we will need to be assimilated into. And all of these functions give the system information about us under the illusion that we are in some way expanding. And in a lot of these contexts whereby you're getting technology to do this imaginative stuff for you, there's also a danger that we begin to relinquish our internal imaginative possibilities and the scope of exploration of our internal mindset. And it's very, very interesting that a lot of magicians proper magicians during the Renaissance period, they were the ones that developed the ideas of the memory palace, for example, like Bruno during the Renaissance was one who emphasized the significance of memory. So if you were going to be a magician, you would have to be able to memorize a lot of things in a systematic way. So that's why they had the memory palace. So, and the systems of learning. If you look at the PK man that Jeffrey Mishlove wrote about, he emphasized when dealing with aliens the necessity to have certain mental guards against the external world. So a lot of these ideas, these structuring ideas internally, are to protect yourself against interpenetration or possession by outside forces. So when you open up this conduit towards an algorithm, you're allowing a technological possession to a certain extent. Whereas if you look at someone like Blake, who said that science was the tree of death and who understood the dangerous aspect of the Newtonian world, a lot of his poetry and his mythos was about building up an internal vision, vision. His Jerusalem was an internal vision. And I believe also that certain people like him were actually creating or bringing into existence a different realm in the imaginal world that was accessible to other people. I thought that's something we can discuss another time. But all the time we externalize our innermost basis and believe that we can externalize our memory, which is a thing, externalize our experience. When you see people going to concerts and they have all the cameras up all the time, instead of being present, they can store it for some other time, some other process, instead of being 100% there at the time. It's the same thing with a lot of memory substitution devices. So we have a gradual externalization of the innermost psyche in this process, and that would be my main concern about that technology. Of course, one can do great things, but also remember that soon they will be able to create a false reality outside, not just in our heads, but outside in the world, and that we will be living in something like a computer game as this technology can be spread around people and projected onto the environment.
Right, absolutely. And, when I look at the technology, something you said really struck with me was this externalized possession to technology. And it really makes me think back almost all the way to Rudolf Steiner. And he talks about these dark Ahrimanic forces that are here to capture, you could argue, enslave the human spirit. But with that, there's also the dual perspective of we have an opportunity to expand our spiritual consciousness because of the fall of these spirits. I mean, do you feel that this tech is a manifestation of that? Is there a consciousness at all to this sort of, or a spirit to this technology that is dark in its nature, or is it devoid of all spirit? Is it devoid of darkness, devoid of light, and something that is completely not within that realm? Because to me, it feels like there is a very, very much a darkness that is attached to this when I look and really feel into it and try and understand and just, I guess, on the soul level, what this is.
Well,
I don't know. Do you have thoughts
a
on
lot
that?
of people, a lot of people may find it crazy, but I believe that the object of the object of the system as it's currently growing is to essentially take your soul. I know people will find that strange, but essentially the idea of dispiriting is clear in scientific literature. You don't have a spirit. They want to take your spirit away. But a lot of these people actually do believe in spiritual process. So when Steiner is talking about the Ahrimanic system, he's not just talking about a system which can be described as Ahrimanic. He's talking about a dark force which sees human consciousness as a prize. So there is no question that the individual human is going to be subdued, assimilated into the system. And when they do, they will lose the potential to act as creatures of free will. And when you do that, when you have succumbed to the process without any resistance or notion of being a spiritual being, well, then the opportunity to advance or evolve as a spiritual being is frozen, or one is trapped in the context. And this is the classic kind of Gnostic fear, if you like, or sense, or premonition, maybe. So if you look at James Lovelock, who was talking about the Gaia idea a few years ago, he said we would be as plants towards this new system which is coming. So this is what scientists are saying now. And they should know, because they're the ones that are planning the system. And John C. Liddy, who wrote about the scientist and was involved in all these processes, he said, of course, that we'll be moving towards the solid state entity. So the idea is that this network is made of silicon and nickel and iron, and it transforms the earth into it as a system, so that will control the planet and human consciousness. And that is why people like Bernal in the 20s were talking about us being mechanized. Now, once you're mechanized in the system, once you're born in a glass pod, and once your brain is controlled, and once you're genetically engineered, your free will is taken from you, and you cannot evolve. So what that means in the eternal scheme of things is difficult to interpret, because one has to look at other forces. But the implication would be that you would be in some kind of permanent technological limbo that could in some way constrict your ability to evolve as we're meant to do. You'd be put into cold storage in a way. And this is part of the process. We're not just talking about whether technology is bad for us, or that they're not very nice people. We're talking about an effort to control human consciousness and to control the human species itself. Now, there's different views about what drives that, and in some context, I don't necessarily concentrate on that, because if one does, then the essence of the phenomena before us is confused and obfuscated, and people begin to focus on the sensational as opposed to the actual and the things we can interpret around us. But I don't have any doubt. And I'll come back. We should explain a loop, or my concept of the loop in a more general sense. But essentially, we're trying to get you as an individual into a loop process, which will override your free will and override the exercise of any spiritual identity.
Right. And could you go into how that free will would be lost within the loop? Somebody might listen, and one could make the argument we're already bonded by technology. A lot of people are already living within a loop type of consciousness with the current technology that's present, with the way that society is constructed. At the moment, there is the ability, I would argue for most people, to snap out of that loop. Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Maybe not. We're getting to the point where maybe there is no return. But for many, when you have that realization, at least at the current moment, there is an opportunity to go in the other direction. Could you explain why this is going to be inescapable, and what the nature of the loop?
Well, I think first, perhaps what I should do is explain what I mean by the loop, and what my concept of that. And so I took a slightly different approach to this. As a lot of people have written about loops, and it comes across a range of disciplines. My argument is that the loop concept is an ancient concept that can help us, if we understand it, to understand the processes that are happening in the world. Okay, so if we look at it, it appears in a whole range of contexts. Now, the metaphysical or spiritual origins, you would go back to ideas that we've talked about, or manifestations, like in the thread doctrine, the idea that that life itself comes from a loom, and threads operate to us and connect us to the gods, and ideas of puppetry, etc., and the cosmic puppets. but we're connected by a thread to the higher force. And this is a real force in relation out-of-body experiences, the threads that connect us, and it reflects the umbilical cord. And the umbilical cord is another type thread. So they understood that there were connections through loops that keep us alive, and that we came from there in some sense. So this was very important. And the omphalos, so the navel cord, the center, is a key idea in all prehistoric cultures. The idea that Jerusalem is the omphalos of the world and kind of navel of the world goes back to the maternal aspect of this connection. So the thread doctrine is one metaphysical aspect of it. Another connection with the thread doctrine, which is very close to it, which appears in art, is the rhizome motif. Now, the rhizome is a stem of a plant that grows underground. I have one here. It's not a rhizome, but I have a plant. The idea, say, in this is a root system in a hyacinth. You see that you have all these different roots that move around. And when we're talking about rhizome, we're talking about a stem, as far as I can understand, that kind of moves underground. And this is a motif which is in all early art. All early art systems, they focus on that rhizome, which is kind of a loop system, exploratory system. They believe that was very, very important. So you can see that, for example, in tree root systems, and you can see it in the design of the Book of Kells, for example. This interlacing Celtic style was a representation of those ideas of interconnection, interpenetration, of things being linked together. And another, of course, a classic loop would be a ring system, a system where the loop comes back and joins and forms a ring. And the ring is a critical idea, as we can see in Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, and it's of course a symbol of power and of dangerous power as well. But if you look at string theory in relation to physics and physical explanations, there are a lot of ideas based on loops now, which seek to explain the nature of the universe itself. And then when we come into the natural world, we see loops everywhere. There's just so many. And then we come into the body, loop circulation system. And also, when we interact with the world, we rely on feedback loops. Now, you've talked to Michio Kaku, and he believes that the human is really a collection of feedback loops. Yeah. So that's what consciousness is. Consciousness is feedback loop. So he can ascribe consciousness to a physical system like a light bulb, on that based on feedback and impulse. So we have metaphysical, physical, and then we have physiological loops. So in a way, when we are having a conversation, we're creating a loop which is going between us. Also, if we're looking at propaganda is a loop. It's sending information into you, and its function is to replace the loops that would be in your mind already about how you interpret the world. We work by heuristics, by short-term solutions. We have an idea, and we operate in accordance with ideas. So propaganda wants to insert loops into your mind. That's why Goebbels made sure that every German house had a radio, so they could use it as an instrument. And also, if you notice, in all the technology, they want everyone to have one, because that's part of the system of the web, the net, threads, etc. The same idea is taken in the material context. Now, then when we come to computers, there's more specific meanings. So a loop in computing context is basically an instruction going to some program or machine to do something, and it keeps on going until the result happens. So it's a kind of a repetitive instruction until a particular result is achieved. Now, this model of a computing loop is utilized in propaganda. So the system is there, if you like, the mainstream media system. So they have a message and they send it out. So it goes out through one influence, or it goes out through another influence. You can't get away. It's a continuous loop until you are informed, shaped by this loop into your consciousness. And that's what the system. So the loop and feedback loops are of the essence in cybernetic systems. So cybernetics, in particular, Alan Turing and people that were working in the war effort, they developed ideas associated with information, the link between individuals and machines, and how that worked. A lot of it was about, a lot of cybernetics was developed in the context of working with military machines. Most cybernetics came from the military-industrial complex. Most industry comes from the military-industrial complex. So that wants to automate things, and it does it by a loop. So increasingly, in the automated battlefield, the human merely fits into a loop, and they want to go further. The plans are to automatize the human brain, to insert more mechanical loops into the system, so they can feed into broader loops. So you have kind of metaphysical, physical, physiological, psychological loops that are utilized as a system of governance. Cybernetics is about governance. The idea is to set up an entire system that can be managed by machines and the elite at the top, so that it manages based on instructions, on information, on rules, and through a whole series of smaller loops, it can enforce its will. It can operate automatically. Now, if you look at both, again, people might say, well, that's crazy, and you're talking daft, and doesn't, it's not realistic. But if you look at Elon Musk, and if you want to, behind his language is this language. So he talks about amplification of message. That's a classic cybernetic loop kind of idea. The Chinese describe this system of forcing people to stay in a zone as the closed loop system. That's their language. So both the Western capitalists and the Chinese communists are using this loop idea, and that's not accidental, because they're all part of the same system. So when Elon Musk is talking about amplification, he's referring to a very specific idea. And people like Stafford Beer was a cybernetician, and he was developing a way to govern by machines. So he had a model, for example. So you have your governance system up here, and they send out messages. It's all about information, and the loops are really about information and connection. So they send out a message through, say, the media, mainstream media. The job of the mainstream media is to amplify the message. So that's what Elon Musk is doing when he's talking about amplification. They send it to the public, and then the public say, well, I'm not very happy. Feedback comes back to the government, but it's attenuated. So the opposite to the amplification is the attenuation. All the people that will tell them that they're wrong and explain why it's not so, and then the feedback system continues. So the system of governance in a global system is based on a variety of loops. Now, when they put the technology in your body, then we have a mechanical loop that's easy to manage. They don't have to do any subtleties about programming, whatever. They can just directly control and command. And that's what they have said they were going to do in the various proposals about from the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is behind a lot of this stuff. It's quite clear. You don't have to be a genius. American presidents have said that. Most of the systems of communication that we got, whether it's the internet or the mobile phones, they come from a military-industrial base. So who knew before this COVID thing that your movements were being traced and mapped everywhere? Well, if you paid any attention, you would have known. But that everything, and who, or if go back before WikiLeaks and all that, that all your communications, of course, are recorded, and everything you do in this loop is measured, quantified, assessed. So, for example, if I go back to 1916, one of my father's uncles was arrested down in the west of Ireland. He would have been arrested and imprisoned for years under defence of the Realm Act, because he was on a list, basically. They knew that he was active in the context. The same thing will happen in relation to all the lists they have. And people have volunteered all this information about themselves. So when they want to alienate a particular group that they might think is dangerous, they'll be able to identify them. We've given so much information to the system that it knows our behavior and can assess our behavior, because inputs and outputs are critical. They can assess through the inputs and outputs from the black box of human consciousness what's going on in there and make predictions, and that's all that's necessary to them. So what I'm saying is, if we want to understand the system, we should begin to think in terms of loops in relation to, particularly in relation to the totalitarian system. But if we begin to think in terms of loops, of power loops, of operational loops, of loops of communications, we can begin to see how the system works. And the last type of loop is the artistic loop. And we can see that in particular. I might talk a bit later about James Joyce and the way he used loops in his work in a deep sense. And this was going back to ideas of eternal recurrence long before Nietzsche, and going back to Vico and ideas of repetition in history and in psychology. And of course, in relation to music, we have music loops and a lot. So when I say to younger people, oh, well, all the music sounds the same now, like my father used to say, there's a reason, because the music does sound the same. And if you look at the Amen break, which I've talked about in 1969, where the 7-second piece of music has been the basis of a lot of hip hop, rap music, that piece used again and again and again. We have Brian Eno and his idea of using the loop in relation to a lot of music, very influential, Brian Ferry, Roxy Music, U2, etc., using this repetition, just repeating and playing with a mechanical repetition and create of ambient music. Notice that, ambient music, that airport music, elevator music, ambient music. Why is it called ambient? Ambient, the environment, because we're going to live in a technosphere. We're going to live in a machine. And this is preparing us as we're moving into the machine. You won't be listening to birds, you'll be listening to Twitter, artificial thing. You won't be looking at the jungle, you'll be buying off your drones on Amazon, drones, it's all this false, faux, pseudo reality that is being constructed. But everywhere in that, in the biological sense, in the psychological sense, there's loops. And this is the key aspect of the way they operate. And we could talk about how corporations work a bit more in that as well. But so my argument is that a loop idea is much more pervasive than in art or in music or in computers or in cybernetics. It's even in the physical world, it's utilized psychologically, psychically. And what they're trying to do as well is to break existing loops, to break the loop of the family, to break the loop of connection with the nation state, to break the loop of connection with religion, and in particular, to break the loop of connection with God. Because if you believe there's a divine source, this was often described in terms of a circle of light. And if you look at the metaphysical poets, I think people like Thomas Traherne, Henry Vaughan, and people like that, they described it as a circle of light. So what you're doing is opening up a connection to the greatest force, a force which is beyond completeness, that we can't even conceive of. And once we open our mind to a greater force, it's very, very difficult to come to a smaller force, to be attracted by something meaner and smaller. And if they break that loop, they can force our attention into smaller loops, which are controllable. So a pervasive idea is behind their mechanism. And if you look at the system, you can see that I'm making loops all the time, even down to the personnel, to enforce these things. That's why these organizations are meeting. They're forming loops or circles to enforce these.
Right, absolutely. And, as you sit here and listen, it's very clear that loops as a concept, you could make the argument are foundational building blocks of the human experience. You could make the argument the foundational building block of consciousness in a way. Yeah. They are the informant of our sensory perceptions. What I'm seeing, I'm generating, like there's an interconnection between what I'm receiving and internalizing. And so, it's very clear to me that there are natural loops. I think a way for somebody to look at their own relationship with, let's say, the technology or this totalitarian loop system that's being created is to try and differentiate within themselves which of the loops, the loop patterns that are within me, right? Which of those are naturally occurring? What is it that is maybe an ingrained or conditioned loop, right? Am I being completely programmed like a computer at the moment with the type of loop programming that's within me? And I think definitely there are at this point, I believe there are natural loops that everybody can still tap into and internalize and recognize. But as we move further and further along, as these external forces they become more prominent and they become more infringing upon the spirit, those natural loops are going to dwindle, or maybe they're still going to be there, but they're going to be out of our perception, right? So that is that what makes it more difficult to break from the, I would say, the artificial reality that is being imposed. Because it seems like the foundational principles, you could argue that these people, I mean, I almost hate to give them credit, but they've really designed a system because they understand the true nature of how we work psychologically. They sort of understand how to dig into the roots, if we're going to make the plant analogy, right, of the human psyche in order to establish this true takeover. They've sort of figured out what it takes to actually hijack human perception, really at on the deepest level. And so if we're moving forward and that's going to only continue, I could see how we almost become part of this hive mind meta reality, especially with implantable technologies, especially if the technology is within us and we really lose the naturally occurring loop, you could argue, to the one mind that exists that interconnects us all to, you would call it God, spiritual consciousness, you know, so many different terms you could use there. But that loop is sort of, I feel, what's under most direct attack, if you will, or what's being hijacked the most in the purest sense with this technology.
Yeah, in my reading of the situation, and again, if you look back at Jeffrey Mishlov's mentor, Arthur M. Young, who designed the Bell helicopter, he, in the reflexive universe, now reflexivity is another idea of the loop. And you can see another person who champions this is George Soros. Now, I'm not saying that to champion him, but he does explain that that's an idea that he uses very, very much about how, when you're dealing with a system, you interact and influence it. And he uses the example of economists and how their viewpoint distorts a system. Whether that's true or not is another debate. But I think it was more complex. But I mean, it shows that this idea is very, very important for him. Now, I make the case in the book that following on from Arthur M. Young's analysis, that in most systems, the idea is that we come from spirit and we descend into matter, and then we evolve from plants to animals to humans. Now, people forget about the plant stage. Already, these people regard us as animals. That's quite clear. They said it. They're quite open about that. Domestic cattle. There's a lot of philosophers now are talking about this human zoo as if they say we have to adapt to this digital park, and the digital zoo. Academics are saying that they've conceded that we're going to be living in a zoo, that this is a zoo that's being made, which is frightening. So I don't know why people are so content with that. I don't want to live in a zoo. Maybe a lot of people are content. But that's not the end of this of the thing. I think there's a stage before. There's a stage beforehand, which is the GIMP stage, and this is a reference to whatever it is, Pulp Fiction. You know, where you have a guy living in a confined space wearing a mask, and there's a kind of sadomasochistic element to this. I think they're having a bit of a laugh on this, wearing your mask and staying at home and all that. It is a kind of dark force behind that. Whereas they don't pay any attention to these rules, of course, another story. But And as we go below that to the animal stage, the next stage is the plant stage. So how can they turn us into a plant? Well, it'll be an electronic plant. We're talking about the nature of the telecommunication network that they'll be building from the 1850s on. It's all called plant. That's plant for them, but it's a different. It's an iron, silicon, and nickel plant that operation that we will be assimilated into. So the idea is, you will be assimilated. We will be immobilized. You're not going to be moving so much, and then you're going to be at home and then attached to the thing, and then things inserted in your body, implanted, as we know, and all that. And if you look at if one goes to McDonald's and eats one of their French fries, they're eating the Burbank potato, which was designed by Luther Burbank or developed by Luther Burbank, who wrote Training the Human Plant in 1907. They conceive us as plants. They conceive us as vegetative, and they believe they're going to put us into a vegetative state, essentially. This is the plan that's been long developed through the plantation system. If you go back for hundreds of years, they talked about the planting of humans, of treating humans as plants and adapting the environment to them. And as you would put plants in or build a glass house for plants, they will build a glass house for us. This is the glass dome idea. So it's a very, very deep and historically continuous idea. So it's not just you won't be treated well and they won't be nice to you. It's going to be, it's much worse. It's like if I call it a dark green man, the idea of the green man that was there in a lot of European mythology and Oriental mythology, of a human face, a leafy face and foliage. It'll be, we're actually being put in that position, but it'll be won't be as attractive green leaf. It'll be, although with genetic engineering, you don't know what could be done, and you won't have a lot of choice in this. And you say, well, who'd want that? Who'd be able to do that? And this comes back to an essential idea of understanding the power of commerce. There's a lot been written about corporate forces taking over the world. If you go back to look at people that anticipated this thing, actually one person who wrote well or who described some of these ideas was Karol Wojtyla, that became Pope John Paul II. And he described in the 70s how we were moving into a post-Christian Christian phase. And people like Malachi Martin say that he clearly understood that the global capitalist forces, say manifest in BlackRock or one of those organizations, and Leninism are indistinguishable. Now, a lot of people don't understand that. But the forces to dominate human nature from the capitalist side and the communist side are exactly the same. They're materialist, and even Trotsky was in favor of the Superman moving towards a superhuman. So they're the same thing. They're playing two different games. So people believe that they're working against capitalism through communism. If they look at what their leaders and theoreticians say, they're leading to the same force. And then, of course, bodies at the top can play both. They can create different groups. Now, here's another important point that's very important to understand about a cybernetic system. If you look at Donella Meadows, who was a great theorist on cybernetics and who advised the Club of Rome, which was a crucial force in this, she says that there's ways to influence society, and she was talking about on a global level. And she said, but the paradigm at the base of it is the critical thing. So she said, it doesn't matter what system you have. You look at a very complex system of governance. The key driver is the core aim, the single aim that drives it. So if you decide, as the scientists have, that we're going to have a scientific elite that governs humanity by mechanizing the human body, then everything else under that can be subsumed under that. So you might see what are apparent different forces, but once that goal is embedded there, that through a scientific elite, through capture of corporations, and this is Bernal said that scientific corporations were going to take over the world by stealth, so that they'd reach this scientific elite, eradicating any idea of religion, the nations. Everything he said is coming true. to mechanize the human body. So what people are not focusing on is this overall aim. And in cybernetics, that overall aim is critical. So then when you come to say, well, is Elon Musk a good guy or a bad guy? Now, you have to go back and look, and if my analysis is correct, you have to go back and look at the things that they said were critical. Space exploration, enhancing human intelligence, transhumanism, etc., etc. And then say, well, does this person further or not those aims? Now, the fact that they might be doing things that seem to appeal to a disaffected group of people is not the end of the story. What is their overall aim in this? And if it accords with those things, on that assessment, you can also interpret, I think, Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna more accurately by matching what they said with the objectives of these people that wanted to establish a league. So some of the good guys, when judged on that, you might judge differently. It's up to people to make their own mind. But what I'm saying is, look at what the people have said, look at what the aim is, and realize that they can achieve that aim through a multifaceted range of attacks. So some things that appear to be kind of liberate, I don't know, say, for example, that Jesus was a myth, that it was never existed, for example. Now, if you, for example, someone reminded me recently about that, the Zeitgeist program. Now, I'd forgotten about that, but I just refreshed my memory on it. And it starts off, as far as I remember, with an argument about Jesus didn't exist. And you say, well, why is that in a critique of whatever it's critique, you know, the world is like? And then if you say, well, actually, if you go back to the earlier, the objective to take religion out, it makes sense, because of course you have to attack. And then there's also the Gramscian idea, that the Marxist idea that you have to remove religious organizations, particularly the Catholic Church, in order to implement the communist thing. So communism and capitalism are united by scientism, and their aim is the same: to form a new man, the same new woman, a new person. This Nietzschean idea. It was behind the Bolshevik idea. It was behind the Nazi idea. It's behind what's happening in the United States now. It eradicates anything. Your nation state, your family, the human person itself, because of that aim. There's a lot of phony wars and a lot of phony wars below it. So they're trying to drag people into phony wars. For example, I find it ridiculous to hear people in Ireland who seem to be criticizing some of the things legitimately. Some of them saying now, well, it's all down to the Jews or something like that. Ridiculous kind of analysis. In an Irish context, I detest that, one, because it's hateful, and two, because it's wrong, you know, and they're being dragged into these silly tropes, which are ridiculous and counterproductive.
Right, absolutely. And there's a lot of, let's acknowledge a specific issue or whatever it may be, and blame a specific group to deflect from the actual.
Of course.
Yeah, that's an ageless tactic, if you will, that has been done throughout
all
history.
Empires use that. The Brits use that. The Russians use that, and it suits their purposes very, 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 very well. And it takes focus on the scientific corporations and what the people said they were going to do, the people that articulated the idea of the New World Order, which was a conspiracy theory a few months ago, despite the fact that there's plenty of evidence for it. And then you have Biden talking about it, of course. Putin talked about it as well, and Gorbachev talked about it, and Bush talked about it. So all of a sudden, it's a reality now that kind of slipped in. Also, a few weeks ago, there was no such thing as conspiracies, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, the government finds a conspiracy in Germany. You know, I've made that case that the people that use conspiracy most are the government. You know, so they just don't like when people are using it to accurately describe what they're doing.
Right. Well, a conspiracy is just a hidden plot. You know, it's just something that is operating in secret,
or not hidden, as Wells talked about, the open conspiracy, because they're doing that in front of us.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you know what you spoke to to bring it back to the beginning of what you were talking about regarding the human zoo, I think that it all falls under that. And I'd look at the last 100 years or so, and we've kind of already talked about how this foundation has been set. I would argue we've already been living within the confines of the human zoo for centuries, or just at this point, or maybe not centuries, decades, however long. Because Desmond Morris talked about this in his book that was titled The Human Zoo, early 1970s, with urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. And if you were to take a tiger that's in a zoo, for example, go to one of our little zoos and down the street or something, if you were to take that tiger and try and put it back in the wild, is it going to survive? Chances are probably not. I mean, obviously it depends on the animal. Maybe a tiger would figure it out, but we look at what we've done to dogs and how we've domesticated them, right? That's like the perfect example of a codependent relationship. A dog's entire existence is codependency. And I would argue that a lot of the majority of the population, if you were to completely force a detachment from this system that's already in place, from the human zoo, most people wouldn't have the survival skills to go back to a more holistic, natural way of living. So there's already been this domestication of humans that has taken place because we've become so dependent on our supply chains and our interconnections within the system, right? Most people don't know how to grow food. And, myself included, I have some knowledge, but I'm not what my ancestors were by any means. So I'm not even putting myself in the category of rewilded, or I think there's some harsh realities that we need to look at, and we're already very bonded to the system itself. And so we're, in a way, we're already the animals, the hackable animals that Harari talks about. So now that next step, when we get these implantables, which you could argue has already been rolled out through certain technologies of the last couple of years, and as its own, I saw an article the other day, and I don't believe it was sarcasm, but it said the next group you have to worry about is the anti-chippers. That's what they call them, the anti-chippers, anti-microchips. So the idea is already coming out into fruition. You see the people who have the chips in their arm where they scan. This is already in development. So the implanting, you could argue they're already digging our roots. They're already digging the hole in the ground for us to go into, because we are at the plant stage, or at least the early stages of that. And we've been in the animal stage for a long, long time with the dependency of the system that has been so ingrained in our psyche these last, I'd say, over 100 years, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, you could say at the latest.
You said a few important things there, and certainly I think it will be a hate crime in the future to criticize a transhumanist. I've no doubt about that. So that's why the wider notion of trans, I'm not talking about transgenderism and that, but that's a wider notion. So if you criticize someone that has done something to their body, it will be regarded as a hate crime. Now, I one of my contacts in Barcelona said that he met the human cyborg there, Neil Harbison, who has this protrusion from his head that enables him to see different colors. He said he was a very nice man, and that man operates for interspecies rights, etc. So there's going to be legitimate discussions there, but I'm not talking about that, what people decide themselves to do. I'm talking about network transhumanism, which is forced, and we have succumbed to a precedent recently which allows the state to determine what it can put in our body. This is the precedent, really, for future technology on a mass scale, and people have succumbed to mandates, etc., and to gross interference in the human body. And like Jordan Peterson, who was so against words being put in his mouth, wasn't so bothered about things being put in people's bodies through force. And I find that a bit inconsistent. But the key concept you talked about there was dependency. And that's the key idea. So the idea is that you get dependent on something, on some loop. It's the basis of addiction. And while we get dependent, the people that control us get independent. Now, in antitrust is meant to be the system that controls big corporations. It's very, very important. Going back to the 1890 Sherman Act, and you have the Clayton Act in the US. And so this is meant to control attempts to monopolize or agreements in restraint of trade. In Europe, it's abuse of a dominant position and anti-competitive agreements. So the idea is the same. It's not good in a competitive market to have people to join together. So say, for example, we have 5 people making ice hockey sticks in the United States, and they sell their ice hockey sticks. It costs $4 to make it, and they sell them at $5 or $6, to make a profit, which is part of the process. And they're competing very hard to get the best, et cetera, and they're in different places. Well, they have to look at the prices of other people in the market, and if they go too high, obviously the other people will sell in there, and compete with them. So there's a natural balancing process in the market. Well, we could use more than 5 to make it work per 25. So those people in the market then say, well, how can we get more? How can we get more from the market? How can we get surplus profits? And the way to do it is to come together. So if they come together, instead of competing separately, and if you like, they form a loop of communication, well, then they can fix the price. So they'd say, listen, my daughter's getting married next week. I need a bit more money. We need a bit more. I like to have a little house in the Bahamas, not much, just et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you say, yeah, you want to fly to space, whatever, with Elon Musk, or you need the money, et cetera, et cetera. So we say, yeah, instead of selling it at $7, we'll sell at $10. And once we don't undercut each other, we'll be able to extract it, because it's a fairly dependent market on those things. So by joining together in a loop, if you like, a loop of information, we substitute cooperation for competition, which is not good for the consumer. And if that gets worse, then they get, which economists deny, but is the legal basis, they get the power to behave independently. That means they don't have to ultimately pay attention to the consumer or even the customer, because the consumer is dependent for the, unless, other things being equal, subject to all the restraints. But the idea is that by through combination, they can do damage, and we don't get the benefits of the system. And they get independent. Now, if you look at the capitalist system and surplus profits and globalization, it enabled companies, for example, to go to Ireland, to escape tax, to pay lower corporation tax, to remove the base from the United States, and to be able to gain huge reserves of money. So their pockets get so deep that then they can control the regulators. Then they can buy governments. And this is what happened in South America with American companies, with banana republics, etc., where the loops were formed, whereby the government itself becomes part of a loop, subject to instructions by corporate entities. And these corporate entities are often owned by a higher loop. So then a key element in totalitarian regimes is a kind of top-down control system. So you have a party system. It could be the Bolsheviks or the Nazi party or whatever. And they form loops below it. And they through the application of force and dependency, they can enforce the will through the system. And they have operatives who will operationalize instructions right down, so that the whole society is covered in a total way. But it comes from the top. Jacques Vallée explained or noted how some of the political theorists explain how the Soviet Union took over the Baltic states by coming in and decapitating the structure of power at the top and replacing, say, 200 people at the top with their 200 people. So this model of capture is used for regulatory bodies, for governments, and this is what the World Economic Forum has confessed to doing. So we have this top-down control system, which is run by corporate entities, but they're not just corporate entities with different views. They're all fundamentally related to the military-industrial complex, and in particular in the West, through the Atlanticist system, the British, New Zealand, Australian, who were joined together with the Five Eyes security system, and the United States, Canada, and they exert huge influence over commercial zones through finance, through the Middle East, places like Qatar and things like that, and through all kinds of other systems, foundations, governments, again from the top. And in certain organizations, you only need to capture a person at the top or people on the board. A board, for example, is a classic idea of a loop system of people coming together. A bank goes back to the board as well, people sitting around. Ultimately, whatever way people talk about fractional reserve and all this kind of thing, how those systems don't work on their own. They work when people come together and make decisions to control things. And the real emphasis in this has been that Anglosphere, as Chomsky says, the British Empire and the United States. That Atlanticist system is at the basis of the control of the sea routes, and that led to the control of the telecommunication system, and therefore they could, and the finance system, so they could move their control up to a higher level. And the higher level ultimately is programming the human, and most of the developments in cybernetics came from that transatlantic phase. So that's the real basis, and that's the basis of NATO. And NATO, one of the main books about NATO by Clarence Strait in just before the Second World War, Union Now, he said that machines require world government. There's a section there which is quite amazing, and he said machines require world government, and that was one of the key texts in the establishment of NATO. So it wasn't people, it wasn't security, it was the machines that needed this. So the machines are driving it. That's why Tolkien and people like that understood that the machine was becoming the determinative force. Why C.S. Lewis realized that we were facing a scientocracy, and they predicted that. But what they need to do in all these things is make us dependent. So if you go back and look at the evolution of the financial system, at one stage there was different currencies, and then for example, there was in Scotland at one stage they had the mark, which would be the same as the continental one. They had various coinage, which sounds familiar in other countries, and over a period of time they had to standardize all across Britain. And people like Isaac Newton, that lovely scientist that people think is fantastic, he was the master of the mint. So he would have been behind the execution or the prosecution of people for counterfeiting. Science and money are very closely related. So they establish one system, because one system of money, they can control it more. And then, of course, we cash, and they say, well, we can deepen this control, and we move towards, well, you can get your money out of the machines in the wall, and then they take the machines away, as they do in Ireland. People say, oh, this is great, convenient, take them away. Well, where do we go? You get no choice. Make yourself more dependent. And ultimately, once you're dependent for these things, they can do anything. You'll have to take the chip to be able to do anything. And all the while, they've been working on our resilience. They work on our resilience to break us down. If you look at the people that survive oppressive systems, they're described as hardy individuals that are kind of some mental element in them that won't let them be crushed. But a lot of this, the psychology of this, is to make you a victim, to make you soft, to make you weak, and to train people to be weak, so that you're not going to be able to resist any instructions if there is any discretionary force in it. Your dependency is guaranteed psychologically, emotionally, even on the system. And that's why they keep on working on that to tell, so you have loads of sports people talking about mental health, for example, but they're not talking about mental health. They're talking about mental disease. No, I'm talking about mental, but not every word out of their mouth is about mental disease and people that are unfortunately suffering from that. They're not often talking about mental health. They're talking about now that's an important area to talk about, but you get a bit worried when you hear certain characters, talking about all of a sudden, particularly when they want a bit of good publicity, talking about certain of these things, and you wonder, well, why are these people getting? There is a certain agenda that comes in. You see what all sports stars, Conor McGregor, during the recent health crisis, coming out and saying, "Oh, why should you be listening to, a fantastic MMA artist, whatever you want to call him, talking about health issues? Come on." So I mean, but again, in the loop system makes perfect sense. Influencers send out the message different, just keep on sending out the message. Well, dependency is the key thing. That's the and last point on that. I'm getting more critical of some of my American friends who told me for years about the great liberation of the US economy and how free it was and how it was fantastic, and it was founded by these noble who turned out to be imperialists like Locke and Hobbes and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of them slave traders and all that. These were the people that really championed individual freedom. They were, and Ayn Rand, individual freedom. But if you look at Ayn Rand's work, Atlas Shrugged, and that, it's a recipe for the destruction of the market system by capitalists joining together. That's what they do. They withdraw, and they withdraw from the system, and it begins to crash, and you get all these, and looks what's happening now. So it's not coming from the communists; it's coming from the capitalists. But it doesn't make any difference, because the ideological communists and the capitalists are working together to dismantle the system, to make the dependent, to do away with business, to close down independent food production, to require that you will have to get food from particular purposes, food that will be genetically modified, that can maintain within it medicine, that can do what it wants to do. And associated, last point, another element of this is the debt loop, the debt culture that you see it happen in Canada. So what happens, this is what lawyers do. I've heard them boasting about some of these strategies. They say hard cases make bad law, but when you want to change the law ideologically, they go and look, in a test case, they go and look for the worst possible example that you couldn't, in any circumstance, you would have to be sympathetic for, and they use this test case, and then they change it. They open up a little gap, and then they move in. So you have a case of some terrible context where a person should be allowed to die, and have a case. It goes on like that, and then all of a sudden, you're not feeling well, and they're saying, "Well, have you thought about euthanasia, sir?" That's what's happening in Canada. And now in Switzerland, lovely suicide pods, lovely fashionable suicide pods. And this won't be a choice longer, because as you abolish values which you assumed were embedded in society, but you look a bit closer and you realize they were Christian values or religious values, you take them away, well, then you're only subject to dictates that the machine wants, and it has no commitment to humans. It regards humans as a problem. So why should people be surprised when they decide, say, well, your grandmother is a useless eater? No, I'm not talking about one's grandmother is a useless eater, but this is what's going to happen. Why should people be surprised why should people be surprised when they're offering in Belgium euthanasia to children? We're given our power from a culture that had some commitment to human dignity to a culture that wants to destroy humans. And part of this, the ultimate aim of this technocracy, you will have to justify your existence. Say, "Oh, look, Evan, we've worked out that you're too costly. You take more resources out of the earth, so we'll direct you. We'll be coming around to get you." Or in Philip K. Dick's story, which was it's the one story that a lot of people on the left didn't like, but in the story, the vans were going around to chase the kids because you could have abortion up to the age of 12 in this short story. And a lot of people didn't like that. They thought he was getting involved in that issue. But the point was an important point. When you begin to draw the boundaries on life and death, when you have no concept of human dignity, when you don't realize that a lot of the fundamental values actually came from a source that they're trying to get rid of, don't expect anyone to say, no, that's wrong, because there won't be any right or wrong. That's the whole point. They're abolishing these fundamental values, the basis of any perennial philosophy, in favor of something which is called rational and reasonableness, but it doesn't have any values to it. It's not associated with meaning. It's only associated with necessities, imperatives of the system itself. So dependency is what's happening to us. We're getting very, very dependent. Choice disappears. They become independent. They become independent of commercial restraints, of regulatory restraints, of national governments' laws. They become independent of morality, so they can do what they want. They can satisfy their own weird desires, Promethean desires, and they can, the prospects of what they could do is unspeakable. But we can't be surprised.
Right. Well, I was going to say, in something like the suicide pods, that's a lot of people. You see that in like Black Mirror, for example, the television show Black Mirror, and it's.
I don't have television, so yeah, some of these I only look sometimes when I get. But yeah. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those cases where it's like you see this taking place, and they did something on. I remember, and I watched. This must have been 5 or 6 years ago when I last watched this show, but I remember specifically the episode on social credit scores, where everything, and I remember thinking distinctly, wow, that's a very real possibility, where who you're allowed to interact with is based on the system's score of your compliance and your obedience and behavior within that system, right? And that's, everything becomes this digital, algorithmic, really predictable reality. And that is in itself, I believe, anti-life, because life is the spontaneous, it is the unpredictable, it is that wild, there's a wilding nature to us. And when if you get up in age and the elderly, if you're looking at it from a machine sense, the machine is going to ask, what use does this person have to the upholding of the machine, to the continuation of the system? And if somebody's elderly and they can't work anymore, well, of course the machine is going to view them as useless, or a useless eater, because they can't do, they have nothing of value, no energy to provide to the maintaining of that system. And so if we look at our culture now, and in America, for example, a lot of people would say that it's founded on Christian values, and I believe there's elements of truth to that without the culture, within the culture, there is a Christian underpinning, but I mean, even that's beginning to be desecrated in a lot of different ways. But within that, there's the notion of divine worth, and that every human being has this divinity within them. There's a reason we don't just go and take prisoners and hang them in the public square or stone them at this, in the modern age. And it's because even though they've committed something despicable, there is still this recognition of divinity within that prisoner, or else why would we have appeals? Why would we go through this lengthy process to ensure guilt or innocence if there wasn't a divinity there? Instead of just, in the olden days where you can't just stone somebody in the town square or burn them at the stake, right? There's a much different way that we've, and I think this speaks to the natural evolution of our consciousness. It has evolved since those earlier times where we recognize the divine worth of a human being, but really this system is attempting to, I guess it's a de-evolution, a step backwards in the evolution of our consciousness to return to something more primitive and really, as you argue, plant-based. So I think recognizing the system and recognizing what the system is, in a lot of ways, we're only going to fall trapped to it if we lose the essence of who we are and we buy into our own self as a useless, dependent, really part of this machine instead of an empowered individual being.
Yeah. But we also have to be, as well as the spiritual aspect, we have to be far better on an intellectual level in understanding what the problem is.
Yeah.
And I get annoyed hearing a lot of people repeating the messages that have come from the loop, because they're trendy, because they know that the message is, I don't know, just say Jesus never existed. He was a myth, for example. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, if you want to find out about, one can read the scholars and one can read the experts on myth, like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and see what they thought, and then put one's view forward. But just I hear people repeating them without it, and that's what a loop is: repeating things, and they can be dragged into arguments, and they think they're clever, but if you prod a little bit deeper, now whether I'm not saying person has to believe either way, but I'm saying that you have to be careful about why person might be throwing the argument on you. Why are they putting the argument on you, and for what purpose? And often, if you fit it into, if you see the aim and what the scientists said, it's different than you think it is. It's not really a liberating thing. It's for some other purpose. And so you have to be careful. One has to be careful about some of these arguments and being dragged into a loop which is not of your own. If you've come to that decision, whatever like that's great. If you've come independently and looked at the evidence and come to a conclusion about something, you're entitled to that, and you're entitled to, and we should listen to one's views on that. But we have to ask ourselves, are we merely repeating something that we heard that has been implanted in our consciousness? Because implanting is a key idea that was developed by people like Ewan Cameron in relation to the psychological experiments, MK Ultra in Canada, Ewan Cameron, and psychic driving. It was about implanting ideas into us, and this was part of the propaganda system. So we have to be careful when we're just repeating things without understanding, or without having come to them, without having looked at the evidence. Because to come to a conclusion about some of these big issues, you have to really read and study a lot, and be willing to evaluate a whole range of arguments. And there's so much literature on some of these topics that it really is silly to be engaging in things that without a comprehension. Even though when you said about Black Mirror, I was curious about what the Black Mirror referred to, and apparently the producers or the writers said that it was the screen of a mobile device that gave the idea of a black mirror. But funnily enough, a black mirror in esoteric terms refers to a showstone, like going back to John Dee, and that's what a black mirror is, or the obsidian that was used to foretell the future by sorcerers and that. So I was a bit surprised when I saw that there was no reference to that. But I'm not saying that kind of. It was just a bit curious. And a showstone was looking at the future. So certainly some of these series are priming. They're telling us what's coming. They're advertising. So, oh yeah, I saw this before. It wasn't that strange. Maybe it was it normalizes. Another idea, another strategy is normalization process theory. So we know that we've determined from examining your internet history that you're a particular, and it tells us that you don't agree with certain. So we have to change your view. And there's ways to do that, and there's ways to this normalization process to make you think that situation that you didn't think was normal is normal now. So that they're experts on that, and they're changing the idea. But associated with this is the critique of Ian McGilchrist and the left brain versus the right brain, and the machine certainly has a connection with the left brain, and it also has a connection with a particular type of personality that wants things to be definite. And an interesting area, which I'll talk about sometime in the future, about crystallography, is interesting that a number of the great crystallographers were communist, and they wanted, like Bernal was a crystallographer, and he was the one that in the world of Flesh and the Devil described the transhumanist future and ectogenesis and all this kind of stuff. And there's a sense that they want things to be very definite, and they don't like this flowing. It's a very left brain. And Dorothy Hodgkin was another famous crystallographer. and her student was Margaret Thatcher. So I think she worked on crystals as well. I was thinking, yeah, left, right, and all that, and another dogmatic view of how the world is from the opposite side, supposedly, if we can believe that these are as far apart as we're led to believe. So you begin to see, and Bernal actually, the first thing he began to work on, he was given the assignment to find the crystal structure of graphite. And graphite is a critical crystal, which is the basis of graphene and some of the technology. So that was there. So he gets the instruction to look at this from Bragg, and who won the Nobel Prize. So this was on an agenda. You know, we want to find out the structure of these things. Some of these issues have been going on for a long time. The interest in and well, I said I'll talk about that again, but again, the military-industrial complex is there, and the link with the esoteric world, whether going back to John Dee and that technology and the esoteric world and sorcery, it runs throughout the whole thing. So when the question about is it a darker force, we're dealing with a dark force which is manifest, and even Norbert Wiener, whatever you want to call him, he described in terms of sorcery. Now, he was one of the leaders in cybernetics, and he said there's a sorceress element to this gadget worship. So they understood, and they probably didn't understand how deeply this sorcery idea is. This idea, you could link it to Nietzsche if you want, but it goes back to Francis Bacon, to control the world through will. And once you get this dark sorcery idea, well, then you have to put up the consequence. Then you have to realize that you're into the Marquis de Sade fantasy world, that what they want to do with the public is up to them because they have the power to do. This is what the desire for the power is. It's to use it. And they will use it. I mean, and they will use it in strange ways that won't be nice. That dark force is there. It can't be ignored at this stage. The death cult, the willingness to inflict pain, the willingness to disregard human dignity, the willingness to desecrate things, to trample on things which are sacred, the willingness to now, for example, I see that they're putting up these renewable windmills in beautiful places in Ireland and holy places. There's a psychopathological element to this, where they kind of get pleasure from taking away some of these deeper traditional things which they see as opposing them acquiring the power of gods, because you can see it from Yuval Noah Harari, and that he's talking about acquiring the power of gods. These are going to be the gods, and he said they won't be benign gods. You know, they're more like the Greek gods who can do what they want at whim, and that's what they intend to do.
Right. So it's that Aleister Crowley phrase: "Do as thou wilt," or "Do as thou
yeah,
wilt." Right.
And he's not the worst of the ones. He doesn't. That's right. That philosophy is there, but I mean, there's much worse than him in relation to people that don't purport to be occult, but actually seem to be in relation to their. Because he actually warned sometimes against sorcery. He warned against kind of demonic type of sorcery at times as well. So he has. I'm not putting him up as a champion but a lot worse than him. He looked like a schoolboy compared with some of the people that we're going to see. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Well, and it is becoming more out in the open, and you look at what are the groups that really make up our institutions. If you look at where do the politicians come from, what is the foundational root of a lot of these people? I mean, they come from groups like, let's say, Skull and Bones, right? In the name, you have a worship of death right there. You know, Skull and Bones is founded specifically at Yale to bring in the next generation of leaders. These are the carefully selected, individuals for that specific purpose. And
So you have John Kerry and Bush going up for the presidency, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Right, exactly. And I think what you described, you mentioned, really, it hits it at a desecration of beauty and the natural beauty that is, it's a byproduct of the natural world, the beauty, but it feels this dark force. It is out to the beauty represents our spiritual consciousness. It represents our ability to perceive, and be in awe and feel a sense of joy that is, that's true freedom, right? And I just look at like the architecture, for example, of modernity versus the architecture hundreds of years ago. You could look at early pictures of America, for example, and in early 1900s they had beautiful architecture that's reminiscent of a place like, I don't know if you were to, in Europe has been good about preserving a lot of their architecture in a lot of different areas. I don't know the full history by any means, but I went to Paris, for example, and some of the architecture there, it's breathtaking. It's especially in some of the older quarters and neighborhoods. But that architecture existed in America, throughout America, but it was destroyed. And it ultimately, you have the New York City type of skylines where you have the skyscrapers and you have these really unappealing to the eyes concrete jungles. And I think there is a deliberate purpose in that to really, if we're surrounded by beauty of our own creation, maybe it's not natural beauty like a forest and there isn't that connection there, but we have beauty of our creation, there's still something to be learned from that, or reminded about the true nature of who we are, when we can look at the man-made creations and see beauty and be awestruck by it. I mean, if you look at the cathedrals or Colosseums, or look at Notre Dame in Paris, like there's a feeling of reverence that is undescribable, right? So I think that desecration of beauty really is a huge factor in this becoming an automaton in the purest sense, because the machine can't recognize beauty. It can't recognize life. It can't recognize the reverence that is underpinning our connection to the natural world. And that is really, I think, the foundational element that is being attempted to be destroyed or hijacked. I don't know if it can ever truly be destroyed, but we can lose our perception of it, which in the case of the machine is just as good.
Yeah, another key concept is in and out of the loop, and that's a technical term as well. So with driverless cars, for example, the human will be driven out of the loop. So this is a constant element. And Jack O'Lull in the Technological Society explained that where you have any industrial process, the organic will be driven out. It doesn't like organic things. That's why you get bad food, because anything that's natural, they want to take it out. And unfortunately, we're organic, and that's what they want to take us out of the system as well. So you're dragged into a loop of dependence, and then you're increasingly put out of other loops. You're taken out of other loops. So you're forced into certain loops, say in transport systems. So, for example, in a lot of American cities, in order to make people dependent on the car, they bought up, the transport systems, public transport systems, and then made people dependent. So the car wasn't the best or optimum solution to the environment. They made people dependent on that mega machine. And we have a new mega machine now. There's the mega machine with technology, network, telecommunications, and renewable energy is a big network. It's a big plant system, which will make us dependent on rare earths. Instead of being dependent on oil, we'll be dependent on rare earths, which China produces or has something like, I think it was 44 million tons of rare earths. It's a leader in these things. And that technology, digital currency, will need all the things that they have a lot of supply of. So we become dependent in a geopolitical sense, as was anticipated by the US government. China wouldn't have been able to do that without the help of the US. So the idea, the deep state in the United States is not dedicated towards the welfare of the individuals in the United States. I think they should be able to work that out by now. The idea that they have some loyalty towards you is a nonsense, and it's horrific that they can incite individuals, soldiers, to be patriotic, to go and die for the needs of the industrial military complex in places like Afghanistan, and abandon them at will when their purposes have been suited. They have no loyalty, and this is another. We're not in the loop of their interests. We're just servants in the context. And the cities, if you look at the new line that they're building in Saudi Arabia, what is it? It's a long line of a glass. It's a zoo, basically. It's just a sophisticated zoo. We put all the people in this long line across the desert with a few trees in it. That's like what the animals have in the zoo, but maybe a bit more. So the cities are crystal. They look like crystals as well. It's this mentality and focusing. Now they're going to force people into cities, into urban environments. That's part of the agenda, into concentrated zones, smaller, gimpier spaces, forcing them in to eat food which is grown in vertical factories away from the land, restrict their access to nature because nature has prepared itself, and not allow access to nature. At the same time, the lack of prophylactic care in relation to nanotechnology means that they will probably release a lot of stuff into the environment to poison it and make it uninhabitable anyway, which also increases the supposed need for concentration in cities, which will ultimately lead to this glass dome proposal because the air is getting so bad. Masks, you've been wearing masks because it's going to be easy to progress from the masks that they've made people happy with to gas masks, to situations where they say, oh, this gas mask is a bit difficult wearing all 24 hours, or living in your insulated house with the drones coming to you because it's so dangerous out there. They've made us afraid of the sun, and they've made us afraid of loads of things, of water, of being in nature. They're going to make us afraid of breathing air. I believe that's a part of the process, and there's already those. Without getting into chemtrails, there's already loads of suggestions about how there's going to be a difficulty in relation to air. This all is really part of that technocratic agenda that has been laid out. They don't want people, and you can look at historical examples. The Highland clearances, for example, where they destroyed the Scottish and Gaelic culture, the Highland culture. By removing people off the land, that now people justify, say, well, the economics dictated it. So they really took all the people off the land who were living in the subsistence. Now, subsistence, they're claiming was bad, but this is what they want us to do. They want us to subsist, but not independently. So they're telling us to be frugal now, and they claim that these things were justifiable because they were living a subsistence life in accord with nature. So then they concentrated people in Glasgow, less so in Edinburgh, and removed them off the land to put sheep on the land. So the history of the enclosures in Britain, it's the same pattern again and again. The system of plantations in the United States, it's the same pattern. It's not new. So we're just going to have more of that. We're just going to have a bit more of that, and a bit more confinement, and as well as that, at the same time, maybe before that, I don't know, before that, we might have this big chaotic period, which will be then justify repressive measures, justify perhaps gene therapy to take out the bad genes that make people violent and nasty, and all those things that Anthony Burgess talked about. There's no good reading of these things. You can focus if you want to on the ads of the things they support, of when they keep on using the disabled people to have their life improved, which we're all in favor of, and there should be more concentration on that. But these are only the tip of the propaganda loop, whereby they're the idea, they're making us familiar with the idea that transhumanism is necessary, and the people like Lilly and that were onto this. They understood that the natural world is going to be destroyed. They're going to utilize all this natural world. Like, for example, in New Caledonia, they're digging up, there's vast mounds there to dig up the nickel to make the lithium ion batteries for the electrical vehicles that people supposedly think are environmentally friendly. All these things have huge costs. These were the things that Lilly was talking about. We've a transfer of natural resources into this system. They're talking about, and the electrical system that they're so concerned with is really, the big cost on that is managing the system, is going to be managing the system itself. You won't be getting the benefit. You'll be at home in the dark, and with no electricity, and just a cost, getting bills coming in, and maybe they'll be negotiating whether you could offer a kidney or something instead for your bills, or a few pints of blood, or God knows what, to keep the elite going. But the big cost of this system is going to be to maintain the system itself, and the artificial intelligence aspect is where the investment is going, to move away from human intelligence. They've consistently said it all across the board. All the leaders have said that. So there's something in our nature that either doesn't want to accept this, or maybe it's the learned helplessness thing, that idea again. Say, well, what can we do about it? And as we've consistently said, the antidote is, it's a loop. The problem is caused by a lack of spiritual evolution. This circumstance is calling us to really marshal our spiritual forces and to believe in them, and to support other people that are engaged in spiritual endeavor, not to be judgmental about people in different religions, to realize that they're going to set us against each other. They're going to set, one of the reasons, I think, if you look at the Charles Manson case, for example, so when I was younger, I was saying, well, why was this man so dangerous? Because when you look at the evidence in the court cases, they couldn't actually link him to the gruesome murders easily. They found a conspiracy to murder, but the direct link was lesser. And some of the things, there's books written about his connection with the state and the way, whether he was managed, but some of the things he was talking about, like about race war in the United States, as if it was a plan coming, and protecting air, trees, water, and animals. It's a revolutionary idea, that, eh? But so some of these figures were patsies that were. I'm not saying that he didn't do bad things, but if you look at the exact evidence, you begin to wonder whether there was a deeper truth in some of the things. I've no doubt that they're setting up groups to fight each other. It's quite clear, and they're using these groups. They're setting them up, and they will be happy once the inflammable material is thrown onto the agenda that they've set up. It will distract from the major takeover of the human race.
Right. Absolutely. And what you just described really reminds me, or it makes me think that you could label this as a rise of a Fourth Reich, right? In terms of, if you want to compare it to Nazi Germany, because the similar tactics that they use, and Reich just translates to empire. So, I mean, in German, so that really, if you look at National Socialism, the big thing within it is identity. That's really what makes it I guess, different from socialism in a sense, where the state controls means of productions and whatnot. But, with National Socialism, they do it under a nationalistic identity. And you can use nationalism, you could use race, you could use, really, those are all just different forms. If you look at how our society is operated, those are different forms of identity that are used to to place people within the confines of a group. And ultimately, it's interesting because a lot of people are being tricked into this conformity, yet they're also dividing themselves at a rate that we've never seen before either. You have, I could name a million different groups that, feminist versus LGBTQ groups, and when in reality they were united at one point. So there's just so much division, and it's the very, like you just described, it's a tactic to keep us from uniting around a more common identity of man, of human, right? And so we're very much playing into this artificial reality because we're identifying already in an artificial way. So it'll make a transition into a machine reality, or really, because the computer is just gonna, they promise immortality in the spiritual sense, but really you're just trying to preserve your ego. I think is really what's happening. So people are just going to lean into that, promising an egoic immortality, really uncovering themselves in that way. I think that's why they're enticed by it. And so, this is taking place all over the world. And I think I like to use the web analogy in a sense that really ties all of these groups together, right? You have this vastly interconnected web where it doesn't matter that the United States does capitalism, if you even want to call it that, right? Versus China, which does communism. At the end of the day, everything it's already in the hands of a much larger, like all property, all of this, the forces that govern society, they're already in the hands of these much larger individuals and organizations and corporations. So it's very much an illusion that there is. I mean, you still have your small businesses that we can support. So there are still elements of freedom that exist in the West, for example, but they're all reporting. If you look at the countries and the politicians and the corporations, they're all reporting to the creators of this web. And they're, like you said, it's a top-down approach. And how we disconnect ourselves from the web, I mean, I don't think you can do that on a nationalistic scale. There aren't going to be politicians that come in and say, all right, United States isn't participating anymore in this transhumanist future reality. Like, that's not going to happen. We can't vote our way out of any of these or implement top-down approach, which I think a lot of people will look to politicians or look to Elon Musk because they still have that savior programming. Elon Musk might promise free speech, but at the same time, he's shooting thousands of satellites up into space, creating the smart grid, and getting Neuralink ready for human trials, which is going to put the technology inside of us. So, as I think it was Albert Pike, you said, when the masses need a hero, we will provide him. So very convenient that he's the one championing free speech and making that the issue, when the reality is free speech is not. I mean, obviously it's important, but that's a very surface level fight right now compared to sort of what's going on in the backdrop, I would say.
Well, it's a bit funny with the Elon Musk thing because the legislation that's been introduced by chance all around the world means that they'll be able to get the people anyway. And then, of course, this thing, the shift towards identity that him and Jordan Peterson are in favor of, about, so you don't have anonymity, etc. Well, that's a different issue, but this is an ideal mechanism to move towards that. And then when you look to the cavalry coming over the hill with Trump, and the army that's ready to knock on your door for, medical procedures, well, that'll be ideal in the next stage. So I don't know why people are looking to, some of the individuals, well, apart from the phenomenon or legitimacy, if you look again at the baseline of, we said about what the aim of this thing is, then you have to interpret. Then all the 95% of things you might agree with are shattered by the key identification with the idea of utilizing the army for a medical procedure, for example, is a very dangerous precedent, and it's not consistent with a kind of libertarian or a conservative viewpoint. It's just in the agenda. And a key idea that emerges from cybernetics is a mutual causal interaction. This is a key idea about feedback loops, which is that. So it even comes to analyze situations. So, for example, when one comes, and I've studied a lot about the origins of the National Socialist Party, which, remember, that's what it was. And if you look at Munich, remember, and this also ties in with the idea of fascism and anti-fascism, because anti-fascism, insofar as it was associated with Trotskyism, was really a proactive force. It wasn't an anti-force in many senses, and you know, it's also a proactive force. And if you go back to the origins of Nazism, we have to remember that the Bolsheviks and Lenin had decided that Germany was the country that had to be taken over, so that Germany had to be the source of the communist revolution. They weren't that interested in Russia in many senses, because Germany was the one that theoretically made most sense, with the proletariat rebelling and leading the way. So that's why there was so much communist activity. And mutual causal interaction produces a dynamic force that is you know, totalitarian in its output as well. So and Nazism was an imperial force as well. So it wasn't about a pure nation. It was, as you said, an imperial force. So that's why I've described this empire that I believe we're in. I believe we're in it, the empire of scientism, because that's the force that draws it together, that can draw in BlackRock and the Chinese Communist Party. They can join together in a technocratic, scientocratic model. They can give you all the facts and figures about why something is true. None of them are committed to any divine force, higher force. None of them are committed to any concept of dignity. They can work together. You have to ask yourself, where did the anti-globalization forces disappear to? They were there. They were here in Gothenburg. They were there in Seattle. Where did they disappear to? They became integrated into the system in many senses. They were bought into the system, and so they all end up fighting for the same forces. Where did the left-wing opposition to this? Again, it was integrated, because they see their needs as being able to be accommodated, and in fact, they probably believe that they will dominate the new regime. So all those things were meaningless. They were all materialist, opportunistic kind of things that drew on various forces, heavily associated, in both cases, Bolshevism and Nazism, on ideas of Nietzschean super manhood, super personhood, whatever you want. And Sri Aurobindo, from an Indian perspective, said that there's a contrast between the Superman in that sense and the evolution in spiritual terms, that the idea that we evolve on a spiritual force. And he specifically saw the danger and contrasted those two ideas. And it emphasizes the need to really have a spiritual alternative. And in that spiritual alternative, the new phase of spirituality will require that people be cognizant of they will have to inform themselves. They can't be as dumb as they have been. I say that for us all, and I feel the more I know, the more ignorant I feel in many senses. That I'm aware of what I don't know, but I've tried to understand, and I will continue to do so. I'll continue to work, and also to help people, to provide a critique that they can analyze for themselves. But we can no longer. People believe that they're outside the loop of these forces, where they're really participating in them with their silence. and they are participants. They are in these loops, and they are contributing to them often by their quiescence, their acquiescence, their quietness, and that even has an implication for spiritual involvement. For example, remember, for example, with there were, if you look at the movements and the Maoist movements, for example, they often had a connection with Buddhism, for example, that people are not willing to acknowledge, because there is another problem. I do argue with my American friends as well. They have an Orientalist perspective. Everything from the East is great, you know, and all the European stuff is bad. All Europeans were nasty, they're not spirit, didn't understand it like the people. And they never look at the literature of the violent aspects of associate with Buddhism. And again, just for balance in the debates, or the idea that Tibet was a theocratic state. You know, that if you look at it from one perspective, it was unattractive in terms of human liberty in other contexts. I'm not making a generalization, but we have to be balanced in this. And I find you can't say this, but I find the Dalai Lama too open to substitution of spirituality with science. I don't agree with his optimism about the role of science, and I some of his pronouncements seem quite naive to me. Now I know a lot of people will say, "How can you say that?" But that's my perspective on that. I think so. Our spiritual evolution will have to be able to engage critically in some of these things, and it will affect spiritual practice. For example, the tradition in Europe, rather than meditation, was more of contemplation, that it was an active and intellectual force, which is underplayed now, because I think sometimes meditation is quietism. It can be used just to, you know, blot out all the things and let it happen. Oh yeah, I can manage this. That's fine. If people do that to help you get by, but we have to be more engaged. And I'm not talking about, because political activism, even that in the future, is going to be radically different. It's going to be a lot deeper and a lot more subtle and a lot more circumspect and a lot more clever in its approach. So the point is that these will be, the approaches will have to be new approaches, and they will have to be associated with the expansion of our spiritual awareness. And that spiritual awareness will have to be able to, well, I think, be embedded in the spirit, in the perennial tradition. It will have to have respect for existing philosophies. If it doesn't have respect for, say, the tradition of Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Gnosticism or whatever long-held spiritual tradition, if it can't accommodate those, or Taoism, it won't be able to go forward. We have to be informed, and of course Native American theology. So learn the lessons from those, look at the things that didn't work, and have respect for those the people that have come through those traditions, and see, can we, because the global thing has happened. We're into the global order is here. We're into it now. It has happened. We're maybe at the early stages, but that empire of scientism, the new world order, is here. It's only going to be ramped up. So any going backwards is not going to work now. It's not going to. We can't undo it in that sense. But we have to begin to challenge the nature of the beast now, and in particular, we have to fight to retain our eternal spirit. If you believe in that, a lot of people don't. I do, and I think that's what's at stake. And you can say, well, I've run away, I'm out of here, I'll go to the suicide pod. But in my belief, you won't, and you won't escape the things. And I mean, that's what all the spiritual traditions say. You're only going into a domain that you have less control over. So the idea of spiritual evolution is always predicated on eventually confronting the things that we have with the spirit, with the gifts of the spirit, which are transcendent and transcend the material world. We can't run away from these things. And once we understand that, we'll begin to have the courage, which of course comes from the heart, to be able to face these things. And we'll be able to find the genius and the solutions to solve these problems, working together with compassion and creativity.
Right, absolutely. And I'd say the spiritual journey very much mirrors the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell outlines. And at some point, why do we all resonate with Frodo when even though he's a little hobbit living in a shire? I mean, he leaves the ordinary and he steps outside of the realms of comfort to confront the dragon, the beast, and really take on the necessary challenge for not just the greater good of himself, but for this higher calling beyond the individual self. And it's interesting because I think even the phrase "for the greater good" has been hijacked and weaponized, and there's a recognition even within all of these different cultures, this globalization, there's a hijacking of our spiritual knowing of oneness, and it's being used to push uniformity and conformity to a technological accepting of spiritual inversion, right? And so we really do have to go on the individual hero's journey in the purest sense to actually gain a deeper sense of understanding on, I think, our own role moving forward. Because if we don't go forward with a sense of purpose, or we bury our heads in the sand, and I've actually had that thought before about the role of the monk, right? I used to always think it was a very attractive idea, and I think there's a time and place for things like a silent retreat, or to really go into the hermit mode. I think that's a deeply rooted archetype within us, to find the peace in solitude. And sometimes you can do more with less ultimately, but at the same time, is that idea of the monk living in the mountains, is that just escapism in the purest sense, right? And I've had that internal debate about that before. Like, I think there's a time and place to be in the meditative state, but the monks, for example, would they be not better off integrating that wisdom within society instead of keeping themselves in the mountains away from the world, right? There is no escaping what's coming with this global,
well,
so.
Well, if you look at behind me, it was a reference to the Celtic cross, which was associated with Iona in particular, and other monasteries associated with Columba. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, everything's good on my end.
Yeah. You're a bit frozen here, but there's no problem.
Oh.
So what happened in 536 in Europe was the volcanoes went off, and it happened all around the world. And this was the Dark Ages, I believe. This has been emphasized recently in reinterpretation of the oldest rune stone in Sweden, where they talked in the 800s of a catastrophe that happened 800 or 9 generations before, which corresponds with 536, when the wolf ate the sun. And this initiated a period of darkness across Europe that led, and the world, which led to the fall of the Roman Empire. So natural forces can intervene, but out of that came the monks at Iona, and the start of really literature of that era, recording of myths, poems, the Book of Kells, the High Crosses, the attempt to unify the pagan Druidic system with the Christian system, because the Druids would have seen that their power had waned and didn't work in this context. Therefore, the Celtic cross was an attempt to unify the sun, which represented the previous divine force in many senses, with the cross of Christianity, and it was a synthesis in many senses. And they didn't go to the world; the world came to them. There's an awful amount of kings and queens or kings buried there on Iona. They came to be enthroned or to get the blessing of the monks there. And when Charles is inaugurated, I think he will still sit on the stone of Scone, which is a legendary stone, which goes back to some of these principles. So the monks, sometimes by retreating, were creating a new world, a new spiritual level, and that influenced their learning, their knowledge of Latin, which had been lost in a lot of places in Europe, was re-imported back into Europe and led to the growth of the monastic system, contributed to the growth of the monastic system and learning in Europe again. So without that center, that hub of the monastic influence, Europe would have developed in a quite different way. So it can be very significant at times, but now I think that the necessity of dealing with this system requires that we will have a universal, non-violent, invisible army, which is not affiliated with any system, not controllable by a loop of power, which can't be taken over, which is based on individuals who are on their own spiritual journey, who are contributing towards solutions which emerge from proper analysis, which are directed towards the dark forces. People defined by their commitment to their spiritual identity and transcending in some ways the compartments from which they have come from and emerged from, unified in a cohesive, coherent force of alignment based on the commitment to values that emerge as necessary. More and more I hear people understanding that we're facing a battle between good and evil, darkness and light. And that's true. I believe in that. So in order to combat that, they must do things in a different way, in a totally universal force, which is based on compassion, which is informed by a creativity. It's not a passive. Compassion doesn't require that you be passive. It would be an active force, which is incapable of control and even incapable of anticipation, because it would be so flowing and unpredictable by its nature and extensiveness that it would be able to act, as I've said, perhaps like a mystic murmuration or a massive shoal of fish that can communicate in a group in accordance with a common purpose and perceived common identity. So, so there's a collective awakening and an individual awakening. Can you hear me still? Because
Oh yeah. I don't know if my
okay.
video just froze up or something, but it's all good on my
Yeah,
end.
there you're back again. So my view, as I've written about the mystical accord and the mystical trapped light, is that we have if you like, a program. I don't like to use that word. We have a system in ourselves, a natural evolution that we're meant to. I think the hero's journey is a description of an inherent system within us of spiritual evolution that's in our makeup, that's in our psyche, that we go through in relation to transcending the ego and moving towards the transcendent and forming a connection, forming a loop with divine consciousness, however you conceive it to be, and with the wider forces which are beyond completeness, which are incomprehensible, which are inutterable, which are beyond comprehension by definition, which are ineffable, and which I define associated with spiritual light. I believe light is the common force, but this is a real force. It's not it's not an idea. It's not a notion. It's an actual force, and this is what all the mystics say, that it's a noetic force. It can give you information. It can give you insight. Now, I'm not talking, and you were talking with Jeff about it, and there's dangers in that. People believe, oh yeah, I'm tuned into God and God is telling me that. Of course, that's why we have to have a balance between the left brain and the right brain. That's why there has to be an ability to explain complexity, to engage in deep and gory detail as necessary, to look at the historical record, to look at the literature, to read academics, to read. There's some fantastic literature in the libraries now, particularly after with more women in the academy. There's some fantastic writers emerging, writing about particular areas in a comprehensive way that explains some bits in the puzzle. If you go looking for them, there's some incredible literature in academia that doesn't get attention because there's a propagandistic element about the attention that's given. And if you go and look for some of the fantastic work that's lying on shelves in libraries and in PhDs, there is magnificent stuff to be unearthed. And we have to go and look at some of that discipline stuff, that stuff that's evidence, that's reference, that you can test, that's based on an argument, that's coherent, that's rigorous. These are important as well, because fluffy niceness, let's be, it's not going to work. It's not just love and light, as I said, there's the law bit as well, the inherent Tao of the universe that C.S. Lewis talked about. So he talked about adhering to the Tao instead of forcing ourselves on, which will lead to the abolition of man and woman. We have to we have to integrate into the wider forces. And that's what all traditions say. The opposite force is to try and master, to try and put humans into bondage, to put nature into bondage, to destroy the earth, to regard it as an inanimate force that's merely there to be sacked, to be sacked by us. So absolutely, that journey is a journey we should engage in anyway. If things were fantastic, we should still engage in that journey. And you don't have to be in a monastery. I believe that most of the mystic murmuration will be doing ordinary things. And in many senses, that's better for the collective, because you won't know who is able to help and assist. And one of the reasons why they're so intent now on dehomogenizing societies in Europe, on changing, on making them more cultural heterogeneous, is a very specific reason. It's because they understand that if you have an homogeneous population, you will always have the possibility of a guerrilla war against you, because guerrilla warfare needs homogeneous population. So the best way to avoid that is to ensure you have a heterogeneous population, and you won't get a guerrilla warfare being able to happen. Because in a guerrilla warfare works when you know you can depend on the community for support. That's the way it works. So if you fragment the community, you know that you're not going to get that type of warfare anywhere. You can't have a urban guerrilla warfare. They won't be able to persist. It'll be easy to identify them, a lot easier than it would be in, say, well, in Ireland, where everyone was, of a particular group. And that's the strategic purpose for that. One of the strategic purposes in that global plantation system. So some of the old ways are not going to work, and the violent approach is not going to work, because the violent approach will lead to checkmate. If the solution is based on going at them when they've been investing all your money in loads of weapons to apply to you, we're going to lose on that. And even your President Biden, I think it was, said, well, how will you be able to oppose the F-20? They're warning you, and they'll be willing to use it against their own population. One of the characteristic loops in the military-industrial complex is they go and fight a war, and this is particularly in the US context, for purposes that serve nobody but the complex itself. They don't serve the people's, with exception, but they often don't serve the people's interest. During the war, they improve the technology, which then can be brought back to be applied to its own citizens. So a lot of the systems of control are developed in wars, and the research development, if you look at the history of research and military development in the United States, led by particular people like Vannevar Bush, for example, is a key player, you see that it becomes directed towards this military surveillance system, that all the research is geared. And that's why these scientists get involved, because there's money in that big pot that comes from the public to develop technology which is ultimately used against other poor people. And ultimately the loop now comes back, the empire comes back to it, the people that believe they were benefiting from this empire, whether it be the American empire or the British empire, and that the people that thought they were the center of this empire find that they're the bottom of the ladder. They're at the base. They're the root of all problems. And they have brilliantly changed it from a class that nobody talks about class anymore, about the working class. Nobody's interested. The left is not interested in the working class at all. The right is not. Nobody's interested in the working class, because they've successfully turned that worker struggle on its head. They've fragmented that, all part of this agenda of establishing that military industrial loop, which is now a security, industrial, military, pharmaceutical loop coming together.
Right, absolutely. And if you have the government labeling their own citizens domestic terrorists, for example, here in the United States, which they labeled half of I think it was pretty much all Trump voters domestic terrorists, then I think that gives a pretty good idea on how they view the average person who lives under their reigns, right? And it's very convenient if you look at what the government's plans are for, control and the elimination of like a guerrilla threat, like you said, because all of our socialization in our identity has already been externalized to online in most cases, right? There's the digital identities and the avatars, and people have community online instead of in real life. And you go into a city or an urban environment, it's such a diverse melting pot. You might have a small community, maybe at your local martial arts studio or in your church or wherever it might be, right? You might have little small niche communities, but there isn't this collective identity within a city that people can identify around that is larger than this global force that has already been implemented, right? So you're right. There is no coherence amongst one another, and we've really, I would say, lost. I wouldn't say lost our tribal identity, because it's still at the root of a lot of our behaviors and how we go through the world. It's simply been, it's simply changed and externalized in a lot of ways to the technology, or through urbanization. We've had to really fine tune that identity, and I would say there's a lot of people who don't have any in-person community outside of their immediate family, right? Even if you go into a church, for example, how close is everybody with all the church members? Or are they just going in for the, individually on their own? Yeah, I'd make the argument that might be a little bit different in a small town, for example, like in a rural community, but those are on the outs. They're going to take people out of the rural communities simply by making it unsustainable to live there financially, forcing everybody into the big cities. So we're already looking at, I think in the Netherlands, for example, they're starting to take land from the farmers, right? What do you think is going to happen to those farmers? They're not in the local communities that they provide food to. So, there's this big urbanization, which in a way creates the scenario of that lack of tribal communion within a population. So, there is no actual harmony amongst ourselves, and we continue to fight amongst ourselves and nitpick at differences, which plays in perfectly to this new world order system. And it really does, it doesn't make me feel a sense of hopelessness by any means, because I look at my own life and I feel like I have, I'm well socialized. I got people I care about in community and whatever, but I recognize I can't go and take on the government, and I don't have any intention to, because I know that's not a solution. Even though it seems, in the same sense, there's a lot of people who fantasize about almost this Armageddon scenario where, all right, there's going to be they envision the final battle of good versus evil being something of bloodshed, when I don't think that's I can't imagine that's the case, because it's not going to end well for you and I, that's we're not going to end the system through the methods that have driven us into that system to begin with.
Yeah, well, as I said, there's plenty of experience of a long tradition of use of violence in the Irish context, and but ultimately they can only achieve particular results, and the battle is so complex that it's never going to deal with the deepest issues. And you reminded me, like Ireland has changed rapidly in many senses. But I remember I go down to the west of Ireland, I go into a pub. I remember going into a pub one time. It wasn't uncommon then for me to do so. I've given up drink, but just a choice. But I remember going into a pub and someone said, "Oh, you're such and such," and an old man. And I remember going out with my father another time and out in the back of Beyond's, and my father was looking for some particular place, and he pulled down the window. He saw a fellow on a bike, and he asked, he said, "Can you tell me where such and such?" And the man said, "Oh, you're such and such. I remember the night you were born. It was raining." And they started off and so I was in the pub with this old man. He said, "Oh," he said, "I remember when your grandfather went to Dublin first," and he's telling me a story that I'd never heard about my grandfather, who became a politician, but was an agricultural labourer and came from that kind of struggle down there for the land rights, etc. And he's telling the story, and he had this memory which is embedded in the community. It's a real thing, talking about where memory is. So memory and community is a basis of interaction, and it's a basis of engagement, and it's a basis of finding common denominators, finding links, contextualizing people. So the people down there were always very curious because they're interested in the story, and there was always a story, and they'd remember stories about and be interested in your life. And this is the essence of meaning. This is the essence of what meaning is about, and it applies to even things like music, and the way there used to be, again, the loop, the circle of music, the session where people come together. And if you look at how music has changed into something industrial, something mechanical, something automatic, something as a performance, as opposed to some embedded community idea where where the music is, you're part of the music, you're engaged in the music, you're in the loop of the sound, you can feel the vibration, you can feel the continuity with the area, it's influenced by that. It's a world apart. And when I think about Ireland, I find it very funny because I listen to all the Americans, well, not funny, kind of weird, that so people categorize, so you'd be a white man, and a white man is bad, and the worst of all the oppressors. And then my father was born in 1918. Ireland still hadn't got independence at that stage. And even in my lifetime, people in Ireland were interned. That means they were put in prison without trial, when I was growing up in Northern Ireland. And I knew fellas, I remember one Christmas actually being out at this fella's house, and he gave me a lend of a comic book. It was about Bonanza, all the American thing. And his father used to come in on Christmas Eve, to present into our house. They lived just outside Dublin, and years later, the next time I heard of this young boy, he was in prison on trial for believed to be involved in big assassinations of people in the UK, because he'd been involved in the IRA and believed that there was a struggle going on. So this thing, like that's in recent history, about the British government being taken to the European Court of Human Rights they were accused of torture, but they found gross and inhumane treatment. So this is not history, but there was a colonial experiment in Ireland for 800 years or so, which was, so if I go back to my grandfather's time, they were struggling for land rights, and the idea that boycott came from Ireland, from the west of Ireland. And my father's family had come from Northern Ireland because in the 1790s, when the Protestant, the planted class, ousted large groups of Catholics, and they came down the 1790s. So according to, if you look at the journals of the Armagh Historical Society, they describe what happened. Like, you'd get a notice on your door which would say "to hell or to Connacht." That was Cromwell's. Connacht is the west of Ireland, and you'd have to vacate or you would be killed. And then the 1790s, so they arrived down the west of Ireland, and then in half a century later they have the famine. So, and Mayo was the worst held, or the worst, most deaths in Ireland during the famine. And so then at the end of all that, I hear young Irish people talking about Irish people having oppressed other people, around the world, being the oppressors. And you say, well, hold on a second. I mean, what history are they reading? And they're referring often to the planting class, the class of planters that formed plantations in Ireland, that owned slaves and went off to other places, that were part of the establishment, and they're Irish now. So and there proves the kind of, and you say, well, this is just not history. This is just a distortion of history. So when people fail to make distinctions and fail to look at the subtleties, it's really damaging, and it's really dangerous. And you can see how these are manipulated. So the same class responsible for all these, plantation system in the US, plantation system in Ireland, is the same class which is perpetrating these same things, which with lumping all these groups. It's a brilliant ploy on their behalf, to turn the oppressed into the oppressors. It's a brilliant strategy in many senses. But to hear people fallen for these things, there is some idea in all spiritual traditions of truth, of things being objectively truth, whatever nuance of honesty, of describing what is real and what is true. And you have to accept that when we're moving into a culture that's not committed to any of the traditional ideas of not bearing false witnesses or truth or whatever like that, they can do what they want. They're not playing by the same rules. They're not committed to any principle against killing people, not committed to any principle about telling lies. And we're dealing really with this is part of the new world. There is no attachment to any ethics in it. There is no principles on which it's founded. There is no higher force but the imperative of perpetuation of the elite that it wants to implement. They despise morality. They despise ethics. They have a sadistic, uncompassionate element. Even things like I hear people, for example, talking about the criminalization of homosexuality, and a lot of that came from the British Empire during the growth of scientism. It didn't come from the church. It certainly didn't come from the Catholic Church. There's studies on that, and it's changed into some modern religious origin. It's just not true historically. So we have to look at all these issues with an open mind, or else we will be just in this psychopathic system where they're laughing at our ignorance, which is pure ignorance, and the way they can sell any old argument. They can tell us black is white. They can say anything they want to, and force us to believe and force us to say it. It's remarkable, but there will be a kind of insanity induced in this process if we don't begin to commit ourselves to some values of truth, which is informed by evidence, which is informed by being open to the whole range of ways of seeing things. But there is something called truth underneath that we can't abandon.
Right. Absolutely. Well, it appears, and I don't use this term lightly, but there is almost a collective psychosis around certain ideologies and the way people interact within the culture and the way that they view themselves. And, I my first job out of college was actually working in a mental health, like in a school, but I was working specifically with students who had moderate to severe like mental health challenges, and there was quite a few
Mm,
of them with schizophrenia. And so I would see firsthand what psychosis looked like and psychotic episodes. And now I think back to then and I look at behaviors of people now, and if you confront them with something that challenges an idea, and not even in a confrontational manner. So, maybe even confront's not the right word, but you just challenge a belief. There's that same type of reaction where it's the questioning of a belief is really the questioning of their foundational reality. So I believe we've already entered a stage where there are people who are beyond a point of return within their ignorance because their mind has been so diluted by these illusions and false promises. And um, and when you're in that state of almost a psychosis, you're not guided by morals or ethics. You're guided by the path of the delusion itself. And if this delusionary ideology is going to continue to infringe upon our spiritual consciousness and ethics and the basics of morality, then that's that's it's inevitable the direction that we're moving in. And I think a mistake a lot of people who are sort of on the fence or are, you know, maybe they stay a little bit more silent. I think the mistake they make is thinking that our system and the people who are at the top, they have a sense of morality, or they're playing on the same moral bandwidth as, let's say you or I, where we have a connection to what's right or wrong, and there's clear boundaries for certain actions and
mm,
beliefs and ideas. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that our society is founded by a group of people who don't have that same framework and that same ethical
mm,
framework. And
mm,
without realizing that, it's very easy to stay passive, thinking that good will triumph because everybody is working towards good, when the reality is the drivers of the bus are going straight for the cliff. They're not putting their foot on the brake by any means.
mm.
So,
Well, there's a few interesting points, and linking back to some of the points you made earlier, on a spiritual term, there is a close connection, in my view, between, if you want to call it a metaphor of spiritual possession or the reality of spiritual possession and ideological possession. And I've seen some activists. I was quite shocked to see the behavior of young people. It didn't look like anything normal. It was more like a psychic possession. And you talk to Jeff, and he very familiar with the work of people like Wilson von Dusen, and there's more people recently who believed that some of these mental illnesses and diseases were actual spiritual affairs. And they believed, for example, that people that heard the voices were actually hearing voices, and that was a failure to accept as real this spiritual reality. For example, I think it's Marzinski is the person who recently is talking about this issue. It's very controversial. A lot of people don't believe in that, but he believed, actually, an example of he had a technique whereby when the people heard the voices of these particular spirits that he thought was spirits, they had elastic bands that they would kind of snap on their wrist, and they would recite the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," as a kind of defense mechanism. The point being that you get into whether one accepts this as real or not into a similar domain when you get into the idea of possession, because possession, whether ideologically or psychically or spiritual is when you have ceded power to an external force, and there is some belief that some of the political ideologies were informed by darker forces in their embodiment. And it would also suggest, therefore, that the response has to be a spiritual one as well. There's no point and even if you look at people like Malachi Martin, who describes the exorcist process, it's a very, even in those contexts with skilled exorcists, it's a very dangerous process if one believes in that, dealing with such forces. Similar thing in relation to ideological forces. And this, by the same token, if we understand it in loop terms, we have to begin to where this loop system happens and the loop system of belief. So the answer is not in the head of the person who's caught up in the loop. It's somewhere else in where the intervention in the loop happens. It's the same thing in all kinds of addictive behavior. We're intervening in loops. So if we accept that there is some validity in the idea of loops, well, these operate psychically and physiologically and psychologically and politically. By the same token, we can begin to think of strategies which prevent or interfere or counteract or counterbalance or subsume or take over those loops, or begin to counteract those loops, or create virtuous loops which are immune from those forces. These things happen because if you look, for example, if you take the studies on Trotskyism in the UK, the academic studies, in the 1980s, at the time of Thatcher, there was something like 20,000 Trotskyites who are active in the United Kingdom. A lot of people, and they're very active, and they're the most hard-working political activists, often infiltrating in other organizations. So those people were active and doing things while everyone was sitting at home watching Friends and football and eating popcorn. And who's going to win then in the long term? The reality is that humanity is selling its soul for entertainment, for the loop of entertainment, for the circus. The circus is a ring. Look at all the sports, even boxing, which is a square, is in a ring. So it's in a ring to attract your attention. All this, well, hypnosis uses a ring. All that, I can't understand that Formula One stuff going around the track, watching the car going around. And now they're going to have driverless cars going around. Anyway, so a ring, a circus, an arena, bred in circuses. The Romans, they knew people, and it still operates. The UFC, well, octagon, loops in the cage. You get involved in it, loops of attention, etc. It's the same process. The same process. And I like watching it for that's another story. But we're all subject to this focus of our attention, and the amount of time that we have spent, all of us in the Western world, on giving our attention to these things. Other people have been working to achieve the society they believe in, and they're going to not. I'm not just saying about them. Any organization that has worked is going to get rewards for having done so, for having taken over organizations, for having been involved and stayed longer. That's how politics works. And then people again, the politics, well, people get the politicians they deserve in many senses as well. So we can't be too easy on ourselves in this. A lot of it is because we have bought the entertainment loop, that we know more about daft television series than we do about history, that we know more about things that are not true than truth itself. So we may be giving up our eternal soul for a hot dog, for really, for a bit of hot dog and Coca-Cola. So they got it fairly cheap in the end. And a lot of this the Aesop's fables, the idea that, well, we're really important, the fox getting the cheese off the crow. In many senses, a lot of this globalization was really people believing that the world wants them more than it actually does, and giving up the cheese, their sovereignty, to the fox. It was very, very simple. And so not being able to see the cost of anything, not being able to see anything sinister, just seeking quietism, just seeking passivity. In my view, it's not what the spiritual endeavor is about. And whatever quotation one wants to pick, whether from the Buddha or for Christ, I don't think they were about passivity. They were about non-violence, certainly, but they weren't about becoming a redundant, disengaged individual.
Right. That disempowerment is rampant among people nowadays, in a sense. I mean, that's what the system has done. It has disempowered people. And, there's a time and place to recognize when maybe someone's wronged you and you were victimized. But there's a big difference between that and recognizing when you may have been a victim of something versus taking on victim consciousness and allowing that to be your baseline foundation. And the world is out to get me, so let me drown myself in hedonistic pleasures and enjoy the shallow entertainment and cheap pleasure during this short trip of human existence, because otherwise the world is out to get me, so I'm going to run and escape from it. And I think that's the mindset the system itself has really placed into people. And I think people have made the mistake of thinking that, and you can look at a lot of the climate ideologies and the doomsday Armageddon and the ideas of human beings as a cancer to the earth, right? There's all of these anti-human ideas. I think people have really internalized this idea that it's like the idea of original sin, right? We are somehow flawed, sinned, and the world is going to act this way to us as it's naturally, and there's nothing we can do about it. And they don't realize that all of that victimization hasn't taken place from the natural world. It's taken place from the system itself. And there's a huge difference, because if we recognize that it's the system perpetrating this internal, conflict, then we can make a change about that. We can change the game. We can change the system, right? But if it's the world itself, if it's God itself, well, then of course we're gonna act in this way, because there isn't a perceived alternative. And I feel like that's where a lot of people maybe have gotten lost and why they're disempowered.
Well, I mean, if the world is not showing that original sin is a real thing, I don't know what is shown. Now, I interpret original sin as being a warning against our inherent danger in the nature of free will. Simply, that's what I see. I don't see it as anything deeper than that. It's an idea that you have a dangerous, like you get a license to drive a car or whatever, if you have one, that you're dealing with something which is dangerous, and there's limitations, and you have to be careful about it. That's what I see it as, the symbology of it. It's not, in fact, it's a release to realize, if you like. I think that they've sold that wrong, or the critics. The idea that you're a sinner, for example, is merely a reflection of the nature of humanity, that we make mistakes. I've made a whole load of mistakes, big long list of mistakes like everyone else. But the whole point of the spiritual journey is that you're not condemned by that alone. In fact, you can look at the prodigal son, etc. It's acceptable to explore the world. It's not the end of the story. It's the opposite of that. It's that you come back to the spiritual reality of yourself. Now, all the traditions say, well, if you want to put it in this way, we have this circle of light in us. This is our spirit, or our soul, or our consciousness, and many people regard it in those terms. and we expand as we grow. We expand the ambit of the dimensions, the diameters of this notional circle, and ultimately the circle of light is a connection with the highest consciousness of the universe, whether you want to call it cosmic consciousness or divine consciousness. It's about that expansion. So what we can't do, ever let do, is fail to see ourselves as a spiritual being and fail to see that light within us, because that's the divine spark, the divine circle, the divine loop, if you like, and we can never give that up. We can't sell that. We can't relinquish that for anything less. And that's the moral of the devil and Christ, and that you can have all this now, because what you have is, well, if you believe, like as Jeffrey in his work that you talked about, that consciousness survives after death, even from a non-religious perspective, that there's plenty of evidence of that. But if you believe in a mystical tradition that consciousness does survive, and also, as all the traditions say, that there are consequences for what you do here in this manifestation has consequences beyond. And I believe that that's a continuation of that inner state. All the traditions say about you focusing on that inner nature, that spiritual nature, and making sure you have that connection with the divine, transcendent, divine, whatever way you call it, and immanent, meaning in the natural world. That it's not just up there; it's a connection, an embeddedness in nature through all that feedback loops, through all those systems, through all the circulatory systems, the precipitation system, the cycles. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about, as I said, I do look at that UFC because I'm interested in the phenomenon, and I'm interested. And one of the reasons as well is because, as I said before, usually the heavy public interest or selling of these martial art or boxing or whatever is associated with an imminent downturn. It's a safety valve, and it probably, as it did in the 20s, is the type of entertainment you need just before the things are going to collapse. And the figure that's the recent figure for nobody. The recent star figure they're selling is Paddy Pimblett from Liverpool. And what I find ironic, I heard a few things, so I'm interested in what's going on. So one minute he's talking about mental health. I don't impugn his motives on that. I accept that as genuine and all that. But at the same time, he's eating all the time on the screen, the whole time in interviews and in press conferences. And he says he has an eating disorder. So I find that very, very strange juxtaposition, that they're presenting someone who's self-declaring himself to have an eating disorder. And at the same time, there's something that doesn't go together for me in that. You understand the point I'm making. It was the same thing I find a bit strange in relation to nearly all of these figures, even poor Jordan Peterson, in control of your life, and the poor man is ending up, getting terrible things done to him in Russia, and I don't, it's terrible that those things happened, but there is a funny aspect of physician heal thyself in this thing in relation to the role models that they're setting up. There's interesting dynamics about what they're shown to us, who they're presenting as the models for us, and how they inevitably present some great flaw in the picture that they're presenting, even that are supposedly masters of this universe, and so there's plenty of original sin in their story as well.
Right. Absolutely. And you could just look to over television, for example, for the last 20, 30 years. What is the depiction they have of, let's just say, the father figure or heads of household, right? And a lot of times it's not a strong, masculine, like ethical man. It's some Homer Simpson, like doofus type of character, right? And what ends up
Yes.
happening, and a lot of men sort of follow that trajectory, not because they're consciously saying I want to be like Homer Simpson, but that's the type of character, that's kind of programmed in a way for people, and they want to, who we look up to, the celebrities, the sports stars, all of this. If you look in sports, and the NBA is a perfect example, the basketball, and you look at somebody like LeBron James, he's very much politically active in a lot of ways for so many of the ideologies that are just so, things like Black Lives Matter, and all of these sort of repeating a lot of the same ideologies that the politicians will say. There's no real, doesn't feel like real original thought in a sense. It's just sort of regurgitating certain ideas. So, but if you have somebody who is very independent, strong-willed, and strong-minded, I would say, there's a couple people that I know who, they do professional sports, but they're not promoted. They're not well known because they have ideologies that go against particular agendas, right? And so they're not going to be heavily promoted, or if somebody is heavily promoted and they're quote unquote alternative or conspiracy theorist or whatever, you kind of even have to look at that and say, okay, why is this quote unquote conspiracy theorist heavily promoted versus this person over here? What's the difference, right?
Exactly.
There's a level of discernment we really need to have, and don't that idea of false gods and false worship, and it's very, very prevalent in our society, and I think our tendency to worship has just been outsourced to these idols, these celebrities. And in a way, there's been a perpetuation of self-worship, because we look at something like social media. We all can build up followers, we all can be influential, we can all create this identity, really, that's just soothing our ego, and we can become a god ourselves and really influence. So it's fascinating. And most people, the way that they see how others are worshipped, it's by repeating the talking points. It's by saying what is, acceptable, tolerable opinion. So a lot of people will just repeat that again, and you get a self-worshiping. It's very fascinating how that has emerged, where we outsource our worship, but at the same time we're engaging in self-worship and viewing ourselves to be gods, kind of like how you all know Harari talks about these ruling class. They believe they are the gods. And there's something to be said about embodying the mindset of I am source consciousness. I am an extension of that infinite point, God, right? But there's a very big difference when it's inverted to an egoic standard of I am the God, and I think that's really what's taking place.
Yeah. And it's funny. I've been fascinated with and I wrote about that, about the figure of the goddess, the dominatrix figure, which is a real motif at that time. And I've been very curious about what's that telling us? What is this figure telling us? Now, again, what people choose to do with their own sexuality with adults is no criticism, and I support people's freedom and that. So it's nothing judgmental or anything like that, but it's just interesting in the recurrence of the motif. And there is some distortion. There is some distortion, or it represents a distortion in some sense, that in many senses, the traditional goddesses were associated with the earth. They were associated with the mother, the grandmother, the source of inspiration, the source of life, the source of water, of the plants. It's a feminine, maternal force that's observed and worshipped. And as we move into the technosphere, there's a kind of extrapolation of the goddess figure into simulacrum, a false representation, an overemphasis, a condensation of that element of worshipping the goddess, who represents a very contracted divine things. And even if you look at the subject matter, all the rubber fetishes, all this kind of stuff, they're representative of the industries that are, have been major destructive industries. The rubber industry was one of the most destructive in the Amazon and around the world. It's been responsible for some of the great cruelties that the Dublin man, Roger Casement, exposed, as well as the Congo. So, but even those motifs are associated with that industrial context, and it's very I do find it very amusing. So the associate with that is this idea of ritual humiliation, as people pay for.
Yeah.
And there is a funny element to it, and I do think some of the figures are funny in the conduct of their this idea of the humiliation, which is also what the schizophrenic talks about, the voices. And I'm not making the equation, but it's a the thought they're being humiliated. They're telling them, saying something not kind of right here as the representation of the positive feminine. Now, and I'm not against that. I'm in favor of freedom of expression, but there is a failure to. This is part of the loss of the goddess figure in nature, that in Ireland would have been a pagan Bridget figure that became Saint Bridget, or some of these powerful forces that really people steered their lives by, that were critically important in their worldview, that were a presence in their psyche, and they're being replaced by sometimes. Now, I understand that that's role play and that, but they're being mirrored in political figures. You have these figures coming that are doing the same thing, that they're acting in accordance with that archetype, and associated with that is some kind of gimpy response from the men in relation to this figure. It's so there's strange manifestations of the move into the technosphere that we're getting as we're moving away from a proper relationship as conceived in all traditions to a divine feminine, to Sophia, to the idea of the power and even dominance of the natural and psychic spirituality. So, and we look in Jungian terms, we have the animus and anima. So we all have these in most of the traditions. In spiritual terms, there isn't a division between the male and the female, or the angels are not separate. So on the spiritual level, our differences are diminished. Our differences are about our conduct, as Martin Luther King said, we judge by the conduct of the character. Now that's been replaced by some kind of automatic system of morality, which suits the system itself. So we'll classify you, not what you do, but where you fit into this story that has been made and projected onto the thing. We can't give up moral authority. We can't give it up. And when you're talking about the U.S. Constitution and that, the rights, certain rights are inalienable. They're not given to you by humans. They're seen to be divine in origin, and that's what a lot of other systems seek to cut that connection. In their denial of anything superior, they're seeking to cut the connection. And the last point, when you were saying about future terrorists, they're preparing already. You can see it in the literature that they're warning against people who are anti-technology. So if you are anti-technology, you'll be in the dangerous class. So it's quite incredible. The anti-technology people will be the terrorists. Maybe the Amish, they're getting worried about the Amish and other people that. So it's kind of remarkable, but they're signaling that. So when it happens, that they have some figure who argues against technology, like the Unabomber, and does something, they'll use that to to cut out and to vilify people who have been anyway critical of this mass movement of the universal deep state into the new world order that are creating the new state of the world through the. It's not just, of course, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, it's the European Union, International Monetary Fund, a whole lot of organizations, a whole lot of organizations that are barely known about, a whole lot of, there's an organization, the Circle, for example, another military industrial complex, ones, shadowy figures that we've accepted, and that the word order itself refers to, and referred in medieval Europe to a network of people that are united for certain purposes. They're all involved in these complex right across, but particularly going back to the Anglo sphere and France. France is an important factor in it as well. And coming from Norman and predominantly culturally Christian backgrounds, not actual Christians, but from that ethos, purporting to be Christian sometimes, but out of there, a lot of that stuff comes from.
Right, absolutely. It appears that with the new order, it's really just a technological caste system in a lot of ways. That's sort of, that's the appearance it gives. And, you know, in a caste, the moral and ethical frameworks where there is the recognition of divine rights for each human being, there is something that transcends our our rational frameworks and ideologies and ideas we have about people. There's something that transcends that in a caste system that really goes out the way, and the state and the system itself gives you the place within. And if you revolt against that place, that, hey, this is where you fit in our automatic system, well, then you're useless to the system itself, because it doesn't have room for variability. It doesn't have room for it. You know, it's not, you know, if somebody is ethical in how they proceed in the world and they go in open-minded and fair, you can negotiate even with a human tyrant in a sense, right? Even with ruthless kings and dictators, there is a level of human element that you can negotiate with, in theory. Maybe not if you get to the most sadistic and psychopathic people, then obviously maybe that goes out the window. But with this technological caste system, it feels there is no room at all. There is no human element at all. So there is no negotiation with it. And natural law and who we are and that divine worth automatically goes out the window, because in a system of order, you know, that you have to fit in exactly as it states. And that's the definition of a conformity and hive mind, and, you know, following along instead of showing up as your own unique individual with your own expression.
Yeah, when you mentioned, even with Queen Elizabeth, and a lot of my critique goes back to the Elizabethan era, but even she in Greenwich met the Irish pirate queen, if you like, Grace O'Malley, who sailed to, although she had been attacking her ships, she sailed to London and met her, and they communicated in Latin in Greenwich, and they got on well and could probably understand each other as two very strong women at the time. So yes, that some things can, some forces can transcend this common humanity that persists. And when you say about the caste system, that's very correct. And again, in another glorification of the Orient, my friends often forget about the caste system and the untouchables. And what's very interesting is that we're becoming the untouchables now. If you go back to, I'm not saying it's not justified, the Me Too movement, but if you back to this consciousness about, you know, and legitimate, and then you put on top of it the COVID and all that. Well, people are becoming a lot more conscious of not, you know, legitimately touching other people as well. But when you put in the scientocracy, you have this separation from other people. You have this deliberate isolation of people, which of course is an ideal mechanism for ensuring social conformity. And in that is an awareness through the zoology and other forces of how it can induce helplessness in people by isolating them, by keeping them removed, by making them more subject to authoritarian instructions, because they're deliberately interfering with normal loops of social interaction, as we saw and all that. For example, during that recent crisis in Sweden was a lot different from other places. So we didn't, some of the stuff we were seeing in other countries seemed crazy relative to the decisions they had properly made here. And but in the enforcement of those rules in the Western world, you could see that lack of compassion, particularly for the old people that were separated, and that just a ruthless lack of compassion on very bad models. And as it turns out, as we know about, when the thing didn't stop transmissibility, or didn't even stop the disease, and when we see what from the medical evidence now, the cruelty in that system is part of the scientocratic method that will only get worse. It will get worse and worse unless people recognize what's happening and not fall down and adore science or scientists. The amount of propaganda for science, pro-science, in favor of how fantastic science is, ignoring all the horrific things that science has done, all the costs they've inflicted, all their contributions towards the military-industrial complex, all their contributions towards the creation of weapons, etc. This intensive adoration of scientists, well, that's part of the idea when they're creating the new caste. The scientific gods will demand that they be worshipped, as they kind of demand that they be worshipped now by us, by the plebeians, us increasingly untouchable people. And when you were talking about becoming gods and through likes and all that, as long as you continue interviewing controversial guests, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Just say slowly making my way down the cast. Which is fine. I there's a level of freedom, I think, maybe that the quote unquote
of course,
untouchables
I
will
agree.
have, regardless of the social ostracization and exclusion. There's a level of freedom to that, and I think that's really, a lot of people, they might hear all of what's going on and hear what you're saying, and there might be an initial reaction of fear, but it's better to be one of those untouchables and being true to who we are and the true nature of who we are than acquiesce our own sovereignty to this closed loop system, and simply out of a fear and a compliance and obedience, because that, I believe, is the definition of selling your soul in the purest sense, right?
It is, yeah. And of course, as we've talked about before, I'm not selling fear at all. I'm selling, I'm trying to look at reality and analyze it. And that's part of the achievement of a proper resilience towards it. And as well as that, I feel very sorry for the people in China, what they have put up with, going back to Mao, that's celebrated by a lot of people in the West, a murderous tyrant. And if you look at what's happening to them now, they would have hoped that the West would have protested against their rights, but the West is involved in this, and the West and a lot of scientists as well doing very well out of this connection in China, as we know, and a lot of your public institutions, your tax money going to support mad research over there to imprison people and bad scientific models as a prelude to to promoting it on us and projecting it on us. So we've failed them in that context, and they would have expected that some of the values that we preached before might have been invoked, and to oppose the horrific situations, but it's priming for us. This is on the way for us. So, well, there's certain things people should be afraid of if they there's certain legitimate things. I mean, but it's not the existential fear. It's not the fear of loss of your soul, because I mean that's what when I hear some of my liberal friends talk about fear of God. Now, fear of God was never about, in my view, and it never should be about, or it's oversimplified to say, it's about, oh, I'll do it because I'm afraid. It's about, in its older sense, it meant a respect for the fundamental force of the highest thing, and therefore, as you would respect things in nature, or fear or have awe before things in nature. And we should have fear, if you like, or in a deeper sense, or a deep awareness, as we would on the side of a mountain, of the consequences of failing to adhere to the highest consciousness, or to align ourselves with the highest stars, as opposed to the short-term brutal force exerted on us, and that's liberating ultimately when you realize that we shouldn't be determined by policies of small groups who achieve very successful loops of power in a totalitarian system. I mean, they're very effective, but it takes time for these things to be built, and it takes a lot of violence, and they ultimately they should be overthrown unless we succumb to a global totalitarian system that makes it impossible for us to rebel or to reject.
Right. Well, that global totalitarian system won't show up tomorrow, and because of that, I still feel very hopeful and optimistic. And there's I think a great opportunity to step into a new level of freedom, I would say, and empowerment. So, James, we're at about 3.5 hours. Do you have any other, I guess, final thoughts or ideas you wanted to share, or recaps, or I don't know?
No, just in summary, I've tried to explain that the loop idea is a very strong tool, if you like, in the mindset of the would-be totalitarians, particularly in the age of cybernetics, where they're seeking to implement a long-held dream of a machine of governance run by a scientific elite, which is totalitarian and leads to a displacement of the organic world and natural world by a technosphere, the mechanization of the human body, and the enforcement of a predictable model of the left brain, and a transfer onto the globe as part of a brave new world with new men and new women. So if we understand that loop idea, a deep idea, which is engaged in this process, we will see what we're facing and be able to construct out of our spiritual consciousness, imagination, and the genius of human nature, the responses. The last one thing I'll mention, I think, was James Joyce, just to talk about the literary device and the way he used it. He used it in two particular contexts. He used it in the short story, The Dubliners. Now, if you spoiler alert in case you haven't read that for people, but you can still read it even. And they made John Huston, I think it was his last film, he made a short film of the dead. And in the dead, it's set on the Feast of the Epiphany in Dublin in the early part of the 1900s. And it's a very kind of middle-class affair and seems dull. Not a lot seems to happen. But when he goes back to the hotel with his wife, a song has sparked her consciousness of a memory of past love in the west of Ireland. and she falls asleep crying, and it induces a kind of some kind of epiphany, I suppose, as well in Gabriel, the main character. He looks out the window, and the snow has fallen, and he's thinking of the snow falling from the heavens, and he thinks of the snow falling on the dark central plain, and as he describes the dark mutinous Shannon waves, and on the west of Ireland, on the gravestones and the crooked crosses in the graveyard where her ex-love is buried, and he sees the snow as a metaphor or as uniting all the living and the dead. And it's this kind of Homeric device of moving out of your ego and joining in the rest of existence through perception. It's an epiphany, but it's also a kind of cyclical device. And the great example of the loop, I suppose, in Joyce's work is Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake begins river run past Eve and Adams from Bend of Bay to Swerve of Shore. So there's a number of different levels to it. It's about the subconscious and the nighttime as opposed to Ulysses, and it's essentially the main character is the River Liffey and Olivia Plurabella. So this is the river running past Eve and Adams, which was a church in the centre of Dublin before the river goes into the sea. So by the time you come to, and he talks about in the first sentence about Vico, the theory of eternal recurrence, and this is a key idea that everything is cyclical, and this is the great loop, eternal loop. And when you come to the end of the book, it's the River Liffey again, and the river, it's coming into the sea. So the fresh water is changing, and it's realizing that it's changing, and it's going through a kind of death process as it moves into, and it's a reflection that the last part of it, a chapter, is a reflection of that sense of transition. But ultimately, of course, the freshwater river is coming into the sea, as she describes it, as her mad father, or mad cold and fury. She's gone back to the father in this mythology, the monomyth that Campbell talked about, because Campbell's ideas, a lot of them came from Joyce, who was inspired in particular by the Book of Kells, going back to the influence of the monks. Book of Kells, James Joyce, Joseph Campbell. The river is coming into the sea, but of course, she's dying in that form as the fresh water, but she's going to be reconstituted, presumably, in the cycle, in the sea, in the precipitation cycle, and come back to the start again. And that's a deep idea in his of the loop. And actually, etymologically, the loop seems to be one of the few words from Gaelic, from Irish or Scottish, that it seems to be Gaelic in it, or Gaelic in its origin. So there is something Irish or Celtic about the loop, whether we see it in the knotwork, whether we see it in the Celtic crosses, whether we see it in the books, or even in the psychology. So there is in these traditions some sense of that interconnectedness, which relates to the prehistory, which relates to the jewelry, the gold work, the conception of the universe, to the conception of our integration and linking with the earth. And if we can recover and look at what some of these artists have told us, we'll be able to begin to create a new construction, a reconstruction of that which we have lost and succumbed, so that instead of giving over to the web, the net, and all those traps, all those electronic traps, that we begin to reconstitute the great vibrancy of our nature, inspired by the great spiritual, artistic leaders that are there, and to draw on them, because they're meant to be. There were gifts given by artists that they didn't know when they might be useful. The same as you could take the Gospels, and there's things in that may have been meant for the time now, or what the Buddha said, they may have been meant for hundreds of years in the future for this particular time. We have to draw on those sources of inspiration, and we have to construct new realities for ourselves. You will see DNA, for example, is based on the loop. It works by creating loops. Even LSD works by creating loops over through connecting its crystalline structure with receptors in the brain, you will see that these ideas are ubiquitous, pervasive, and useful. And we have to begin to draw on imaginatively as we begin to construct a proper response that will enable us to perceive links between us as we form loops with other people, as we begin to create a constituency of independent, invisibly coordinated, aligned people who are united by their commitment to the spiritual path, to act as a counterforce in a peaceful, non-violent way, in a creative and compassionate way, to act in an inspirational way, to contribute towards the dialogue and to contribute towards the discourse in a positive way. So I'm very positive. I hope nobody takes any negative thing out of that. There's no negative place to go to. We have to be positive.
Right. I agree with you. I'm right there with you. I also hold a immense positivity over it. And, when I think of the most profound loop symbol, I think of the infinity sign. I mean, that's just, and you think of what is the nature of infinity. Well, it's, you can't rationalize it necessarily, right? So there's a deep,
and of course the sacred hoop in the indigenous traditions, which they often regard as broken. So in indigenous terms, we want to repair the broken hoops of the whole, the universe and our world together. I think there's a deep truth in the indigenous traditions as well.
Right. But, absolutely.
As always, thanks for the conversation, and I think it flows naturally on from our previous conversations and builds on and moves seamlessly and loops and interweaves into the next part.
I was gonna say it'll perfectly bridge for the next conversation, and that'll flow in exactly as it's meant to when it's meant to. And I'm already looking forward to it, because these are, for me, there's like an integration period afterwards where I take in the information, and then once I feel like I've integrated it, the next one is ready, it seems. So as always,
it's great. So appreciate that, and appreciate your listening and exploring these ideas. And it's only through sharing and polishing ideas and seeking to articulate them or improve them, and developing a hypothesis that doesn't threaten anybody, that seeks to be positive and seeks to be healing, and even and seeks to be correct, seeks to be based on evidence, that we can contribute something. So thanks again, appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all the listeners tuning in, I would again highly encourage going and purchasing James's latest book, Plantation of the Automatons. I have my copy. It's on the other side of the room. I'm not going to go get up and show it, but but I do have it, and I've been reading it, and it's fantastic. And like I said, really expands on, if people think these conversations are expansive and in depth, which they are, just wait until I pick up the book. So
and it's a good weapon if you have to use it against an intruder.
Absolutely. 800 pages, Goliath in weight. So
if I don't see you or talk to you, have a great Christmas and winter solstice is an important time for me as well, and Happy New Year, and to you and your family. So
thank you, and to you as well, James. Thank you. This is feels like it's a big next month and a half, just in general, all areas of life, and this is a beautiful time to so this is probably my favorite time of year, the holidays, even though it's a little cold and it's been nothing but snowing where I am, but that's okay.
Well, I was out swimming yesterday. It was -11 in the air, so I still got in the lake. It was great, invigorating. Yeah.
I was gonna say Wim Hof over here. That's ice bath.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all the listeners for also tuning in, and we'll see you all on the next episode. So long.